Education Without the State by Tom Woods. This audiobook was assembled for your convenience by Libertarian. You can support this production and productions like it by visiting Libertarian.com. Be sure to subscribe to The Tom Woods Show, available on iTunes and Stitcher. You can find this free ebook for download at tomwoods.com. In addition, you can find information about Tom's Liberty Classroom, the Ron Paul Homeschool Curriculum, the Contra Krugman Podcast, and other projects from Tom Woods at tomwoods.com. Education Without the State. Introduction. Public schooling is as close to the official religion of the United States as any institution is ever likely to be. And if you're reading this book, you are likely a heretic. Education Without the State brings together some of the conversations I've had about education on The Tom Woods Show, my weekday podcast. 5 days a week I cover some aspect of libertarianism. That gives me a treasure trove of material on which I can draw to assemble books like this one. If you like what you read here, subscribe to The Tom Woods Show for free on iTunes or Stitcher, and become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Tom Woods, October 2016. Chapter 1. Separating School and State, with Sheldon Richman. Sheldon Richman is the author of numerous books, including Separating School and State, How to Liberate America's Families. Visit him at sheldonrichman.com. This was episode 62 of The Tom Woods Show.
Sheldon Richman is vice president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, FFF.org, and is editor of their monthly journal, Future of Freedom. For 15 years, he was editor of The Freeman, published by the Foundation for Economic Education. His books include Your Money or Your Life, Why We Must Abolish the Income Tax, Tethered Citizens, Time to Repeal the Welfare State, with a foreword by Ron Paul, and the book we're talking about today, Separating School and State, How to Liberate America's Families. Sheldon Richman, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Now, I wanted to dig out, I have a copy of Separating School and State, this book of yours from 1994, and I wanted to dig this out and talk about it because this whole subject, I think, is one of these issues that for libertarians, it's kind of tricky. Like, everybody's against NSA spying. That's a sexy issue that everybody loves to talk about because we're all against it. But when it comes down to something like this, I think this is an issue where a lot of libertarians want to turn and run. They don't want to tell their friends they're against all tax-funded education. So I wanted to bring you on and sort of, maybe as devil's advocate, I could throw some arguments at you that are common and see how you, somebody who's written a book on this, would parry them. Ready?
Sure.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, well, let's first, before we get into the obvious one, I think the most obvious one will be the poor won't get educated. So let's save that for a little bit later. Okay. I guess I would first start off by asking, why do you think, we all agree that there are problems with the government-run schools and the kids aren't learning what they should be learning, but look, that's because they've been deprived of funds and we don't have the right priorities and we favor basketball players over scholars, and if only we could change this, then we could get our act together. Why would you think the solution would be root and branch getting rid of the whole system?
Well, the idea that they haven't spent enough money is laughable because they've been spending amazing amounts of money year after year for 20 or so years. They've been increasing the amount of spending. I don't have those numbers right at hand, but they haven't shown any results. There's no improvement. In fact, we just had results released from an international test in math just last week. I think of fifth graders or 15-year-olds. I forget exactly which one, and it showed that once again the U.S. Falling behind. So it doesn't compete very well. Money doesn't seem to be making any change. The other thing is the worst districts in the world. Certainly in the country. Have the highest per capita spending. If you look at Detroit or Chicago, these inner city schools, Washington, D.C., they have they're spending thousands of dollars, 10,000 or more per student, and they have the worst results than even in other public school districts, government school districts that spend less per capita. So there's no correlation between the amount of money spent and the performance of the children. So that is not the problem.
Well, what would, in your libertarian paradise, I'm sorry, I'm trying to be like the average guy who's objecting
Sure.
here. In your utopia, where there wouldn't be any taxes collected and public services would be suffering everywhere, the worst suffering would be in the educational sector, because how can you expect some working mom to be able to afford school tuition? I mean, say what you will about government and its inefficiencies, it gets those kids in the classroom and it gets them learning how to read and to be able to get out there in the economy and prosper. And you want to take that away.
Well, a couple things about that. A lot of those poor parents are themselves products of government schools, and I think that's one reason why they're poor. Government produces many obstacles to individual self-advancement economically. And one of those, the biggest obstacles, are its schools. If you look at the inner city schools, I mean, they're just sabotaging generation after generation. If you set out to ruin generations of kids, you could not design a better system than the one we have. So that's one reason alone that parents today don't seem to have enough money to educate their kids. But there's a lot of other ways to look at this. I mean, back in the 80s, Marva Collins was a teacher, I guess a former public school teacher in Chicago, who got sick of the schools and set up her own school in using a church, a room in a church, spare room in a church. And she had some kids from some of the worst schools who could hardly read, and had them reading Shakespeare within a very short time. This was publicized on 60 Minutes, and she wrote a book. She was quite celebrated for a while. She was not spending very much per capita, and so therefore, I'm sure the parents weren't. The other thing is we have the work of James Tooley to draw on, which is very, very important. James Tooley has spent, I don't know how many years, the last 10 years or more, traveling the world, going to some of the poorest places, like in Asia and Africa, and he finds in the cities of these countries, he finds for-profit private schools for poor people. Now, normally he'll go into one of these towns and say, "Does anybody know of a private school for poor people?" And they laugh at him and they say, "Of course, there's not going to be any private schools for poor people. They wouldn't be able to afford it." And in every case, he finds at least one school, and usually more than one, where the teacher is usually from that community, who cares very much about the kids, who works very closely with the parents, and they have sliding scale of tuition, and sometimes people are even just trading produce, the stuff that they're growing. And these kids are getting a decent education. They outperform the kids in the public schools. So this is a bogus problem that somehow people are not going to be able to afford education. They're only judging that by the inflated prices or inflated costs that the government school system has. But we shouldn't be surprised that government system has inflated costs.
Well, I guess I would also say to the person who makes this complaint, try to imagine yourself in a situation in which there is no government funding of elementary and secondary level education. Don't you think you personally would be more likely to make a donation or contribute it to the endowment of your own elementary school, your own junior high, your own high school, that where you feel like you have a special connection from your own experience? Like, wouldn't you kick in? The reason you don't kick in now is because you don't have to, but don't you feel like there are enough nice people in the country, given that there are enough of you who are complaining about what life would be like under libertarianism? Don't you think you guys together could probably make a difference in people's lives? I mean, they don't ever stop and think, maybe I could be part of the solution, instead of sitting around trying to figure out who else could do it.
No, that's a very good point. And then a bigger sort of a bigger way to look at that is the fact that there have always been, going back into the well into the 19th century, there have been private foundations that gave money to help kids get an education. People care about education, and lots of people, when they amass some fortune, like to endow schools or endow foundations, which then give scholarships. It's happening today as well, but you're right, it would be much more widespread if people just had more of their own money, if they were able to keep their money, and if they didn't, they couldn't fall back on the old excuse that the government's taking care of this, so there's nothing for me to do.
Now, another side of this coin, though, might be, maybe somebody might say, what if I concede to you that, yes, the market may well be able to provide education even for people who aren't that well off financially, but you libertarians are also against compulsory attendance laws. So even if we establish schools that these parents could afford, you won't force the parents to send the kids to these schools. So once again, it shows how antisocial and head in the clouds you libertarians are.
Yeah, well, I don't know what to say about someone who thinks it takes force to get parents to send their kids to school. I mean, parents love their kids for the most part. Poor parents are no different from other parents. One proof of that is when a government sets up a voucher program, often like a pilot program, and this is not meant to be an endorsement of vouchers. I oppose vouchers for reasons you might want to get into, but just to take it as a case, they may in a pilot program, the government authority may say we have 300 slots. Okay, well, we have 300 vouchers to offer to parents, and 3,000 people line up to get them. So what does that tell you? It tells you that parents care about their kids. Parents know their kids are getting a rotten education in the government schools, particularly in the inner cities. And when they get a chance to do something about it, they grab it in great numbers. And so, this idea that we need compulsory attendance, I think it betrays a lack of confidence in people. The other problem with compulsory attendance on the part of the government is the government's going to have to define all the terms. In other words, if you have to send your kid to school, it gets to define what a school is. And but that way they can crush private initiative by defining something as not being a school. See, what's missing from the government system, and there's no way a government bureaucracy could ever put it into the system, is entrepreneurship. Something I know you know a great deal about. We need entrepreneurship in education, and in order to have that, we need complete freedom on both the demand side and the supply side, so that people can offer new ideas. They can try things. They can engage in trial and error, which is always a path to success, without a bureaucracy having the right to say yes or no, or the power to say yes or no to any given idea. That's what we are lacking, and government will never be able to bring that to its system.
Let's go back to the subject of vouchers that you mentioned, because I guess we should address this, because you often hear in policy wonk circles that the correct approach is so-called school choice. We'll make sure that everybody gets some amount that may be somewhere in the ballpark of the per capita spending on education, and just hand it to the parent, and then they get to spend it at government-designated schools, and then this elicits the best from these schools, because now they have to compete with each other. What's wrong with that model? Sounds like a free market in education. What's wrong with it?
Well, yeah, and I think that the people that most of the people that push it and people that helped devise it, Milton Friedman, maybe the major person, I believe they were they had the best of motives, and I think they meant extremely well by that. But I think they simply underrated how much power that still gives the government. If the government is going to be directing the money, via the parents' wishes to a particular school, it's going to inevitably want to attach strings to that, because the money, first of all, will always be perceived as being taxpayer money, even though you could say, no, it's actually the parent's money because the parent was going to get taxed. That's not how it's going to appear to the general public. It's certainly not going to appear that way to the special interests, like the teachers, for example, the administrators. So they're going to demand, and you hear this every time, we can't have tax money, public money, going to unaccountable institutions. Well, the moment that prevails, and it always does prevail, that means then the government authority gets to set rules for so-called private schools. And even today, private schools are under a regulation. They have the power to regulate. The Supreme Court says they can do that. But the voucher will permit even more regulation. For example, in Wisconsin, when they started to let money go to religious schools, they said the Supreme Court said, well, you can go to a religious school as long as religion is not integral to the curriculum, and that the parents can opt their kids out of the religion classes. But there are some religious schools that religion is integrated through the whole curriculum. It's not a discrete class that a kid can just opt out of. And that in a voucher system, that school will be not permitted to accept vouchers, which puts them at a competitive disadvantage. Some parents will say, "Well, I won't go to that school because they can't take the voucher." So there are going to be rules which will stifle educational innovation under a voucher system. So while I would say, nice try, I would have to follow it up by saying no cigar. It doesn't really create a competitive market. It creates sort of an artificial market.
I can understand, though, even though I might not agree with them, why somebody might nevertheless say, since the Sheldon-Richman solution is unlikely to occur, this is a second-best option. Would you be willing to accept vouchers as a second-best option, or would you say it's just going so far in the wrong direction that I just want to think about the problem differently?
Yeah, I don't agree that it's a step in the right direction. I mean, someone will say to me, "Well, don't you approve of transition steps in the right direction?" And if I thought it was in the right direction, I might say yes. The fact is, I don't think it's in the right direction. My old friend, the late Marshall Fritz, who was a great champion of separating school and state, like to put it this way: the voucher is like attempting to bridge a 10-foot chasm with two 5-foot planks. It just won't work. Right now, we have 88 or 90% of students on the government dole, namely the public schools, with about 10 not on the government dole. What the voucher plan presumes to do is to put 100% on the government dole as a way to getting to zero. And he wondered how the heck does that work? The other problem is the voucher movement is a rather disparate group of people. About half of them think the voucher will strengthen the public schools, and even Friedman argued this because of the competition. They don't want to lose children to private schools, so they'll get better. And the other half of the movement thinks it'll end up destroying the public schools, and actually think that's a good thing. In other words, the competition will be so great that nobody will be left in the public schools. Well, both can't be true, right? It can't both strengthen and destroy the public schools. There's something wrong.
Yeah, it's funny that it kind of reminds me of the way the protectionists think about international trade, right? International trade is terrible for the rich countries, but then they turn around and say international trade exploits the poor countries. Somebody's got to be benefiting from international trade somewhere. All right, I want to ask you though. I found it interesting in your book that in addition to raising the kinds of issues we would expect you to raise, like what would happen without these sorts of schools, what are the origins of these schools, you also attack the kind of schooling that traditionally goes on in a K through 12 environment. Can you elaborate on that? Like, what's wrong with the actual approach that's being taken in the classroom from your point of view?
Well, it was an approach that was devised initially in Germany in the 19th century. And American social scientists and educators spent time in Germany, Bismarck's Germany, in the later 19th century, and decided to bring that model here, although to some extent the model was already being pursued in the earliest days of public schools, which begins roughly around 1840 and then spreads through the states. It was a very regimented, authoritarian environment. If you think about it for a second, kids are sitting there, kids who are full of energy, want to move around, want to talk. They're ordered to sit still and be quiet for some period of time, and then when a bell rings, they're supposed to stop thinking about what they were thinking, math, let's say, and immediately turn to something else, geography. Even though they might be full of enthusiasm for math and want to keep talking about it, keep studying it, keep doing problems. But no, that's not the way it goes. The bell rings, and it's almost like Pavlovian, right? The bell rings, and then you switch. You turn your mind off to one subject and turn it on to another. It's a highly authoritarian system. Schools look like prisons. It's amazing when I drive around and see schools. They look like prisons to me. And it's an old-fashioned model that was based on basically, mainly based on the idea that schools were needed to train factory workers, civil servants, and soldiers. In other words, it was serving the state and also the state's allies in the world of big business. That wanted to make sure there was a nice flow of not complacent, but quiescent workers and civil servants to work in the bureaucracies and soldiers. That's not what we need. Education should be about producing independent, thoughtful, innovative self-starters, and that's not what the schools are aimed at doing. People recognize this for a long, long time. John Stuart Mill understood it. H.L. Mencken understood it. If you go through the world of liberalism, I mean that in the sense of libertarianism, you see this constant criticism of the government system, that it's designed to produce conformity and things that we shouldn't be admiring.
And you have a chapter here called "Why There Are Public Schools," and I just want to read this one passage, this one couple sentences. Despite their differences, the thinkers discussed in this chapter shared at least one principle. They believed that the school should be the mechanism through which the state, run by the intellectual elite, would shape the youth of the nation. In a word, the school's business would be indoctrination. Now, this is not the usual version of things, right? The usual version is, education is a public good, and what's government for if not to provide public goods? But you and I and others take a more cynical view of what the state is up to here. When the state is giving us something for free, we want to look that gift horse in the mouth and say, what exactly is really going on here? Now, what do you think is going to be happening? I'm going to ask you to put your prognosticator hat on. And what do you think? Obviously, we can't anticipate what some entrepreneur is going to come up with, but obviously we are living at a time when tremendous change is possible in education because of the technology that's available, and it could be possible now for more and more kids not to have to quit doing math because the bell rang and go on to the next regimented part of their day. And by the way, it would warm my heart if there were a lot of kids who felt so strongly about math that they wanted to keep doing problems. I almost was a math major, and that's really great even to think about that. But I mean, what do you think? Because it seems to me that both the technology and the falling prices, I mean, you can very cheaply educate somebody now with internet-based courses and stuff. Where do you think we're actually going?
Well, I hope it's going in that direction. There has been some, slow and steady increase in homeschooling, and a lot of that, I believe, is discovering the World Wide Web, and because there are curricula and different approaches that you can now follow through the internet. So I hope. It's hard to make a prediction. I hope it's going that way. And all I can say is we need to spread the word and talk about it and let people know, because most people don't spend time thinking philosophically about these things, and they kind of do things the way they learned it. I mean, most people went through public school, so they think, hey, I turned out okay, so it's okay for my kids. And but inner city parents are wiser than I think other parents, because they see it. They're fully aware of the lousy situation their children are in. It's not only the teachers who may not care very much, which is not to say there are no teachers that care. There are many, but for the most part, that they leave something to be desired. And plus, these schools are dangerous, and there's cops everywhere, and it's just it's a stifling atmosphere. And I think people are looking for a better way, and they just need to see that this can be done outside of the traditional framework. And they need, we need to promote people like John Holt, who was a great philosopher of education. John Taylor Gatto, you can find his videos on YouTube talking about this. When Gatto and people like that talk, I mean, it's just so exciting what the possibilities are, that we don't need to put up with these dinosaur institutions any longer.
Now, Sheldon, of course, you write about many different topics, but if people wanted to follow your writing online, where would they find it?
Well, my primary writing is now occurring at the Future of Freedom Foundation, which is fff.org. And I also have a blog called Free Association, which you can reach at sheldonrichman.com.
Great. Well, Sheldon, I appreciate your time. I think we covered a lot of ground, and I hope people will check out your book. Separating School and State is the title, How to Liberate America's Families. It's 1994, the publication date. Here we are at the end of 2013, but we still need to read and absorb this. And it's a quick read. It's enjoyable. You'll learn an awful lot. It's just the kind of book I really like. So, Sheldon, thanks for your time today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That was Sheldon Richman on The Tom Woods Show, Episode 62. Chapter 2, Low-Cost Private Schools in the Developing World, with Pauline Dixon. Pauline Dixon is a professor of international development and education at Newcastle University and has extensive experience working in Asia and Africa. She is Director of Research at the university's E.G. West Center and the author of International Aid and Private Schools for the Poor. This was episode 71 of The Tom Woods Show.
I want to focus right now on Pauline Dixon, our guest, who's a senior lecturer in international development and education at Newcastle University in the UK. She's also research director of the E.G. West Center at the university and degree program director of the Masters in International Development and Education. She is the author of International Aid and Private Schools for the Poor, Smiles, Miracles, and Markets. It's my pleasure right now to welcome to the program Pauline Dixon. Pauline, thanks for being here with us today.
Tom, it's my pleasure.
I like to think of myself as someone who's reasonably well-informed as to what's going on out there in the world of classical liberalism, and yet I'm very sorry to say I didn't know about your important work at all until your tremendous TED Talk was brought to my attention. Can you give us a brief digest of the points you made in that talk? Although, before that, I guess I want to know, how do you get to give a TED Talk?
Oh, gosh. Well, you have to be invited to do a TED Talk. So my TED Talk was TEDx in Glasgow. So I was invited to do a talk about low-cost private schools.
All right, great. So what's your message? And, not that TED Talks have a political agenda necessarily, but I think your message is vastly different from what people would expect. People expect talks on innovation and this and that. You're saying something that runs deeply counter to what pretty much everyone believes.
Yeah, and I guess you're right, Tom. So I suppose this started about 13 years ago when we started looking into how children were being educated in slum areas around the world. And it really started because of a Sir John Templeton Foundation grant, which we got in about 2001, I think. And we were awarded $1 million to go into slum areas in Africa and India and China and to see what was happening, how children and where children went to school, and to see if low-cost private schools existed or not. First of all, to see, did they exist? Secondly, if they did exist, what did they actually look like? And three, if they did exist and we found out what they looked like, how did they compare to the government schools that operated within the same area? And we carried out research in countries that were on lists of UNESCO or the World Bank as being very poor. So we went to countries in Africa, which were Ghana, Nigeria, and Kenya. And we also went to India and China. And we went into slum areas and we did a survey and a census of schools within those slum areas. We walked around all of the alleyways and around every street corner, and we plotted these schools on a map. And once we'd found a school, we went into the school and did various things within those schools, and that was the start of it.
I think what surprised me the most about your talk was the very existence of the low-cost private schools that you were finding in these various places, because this runs contrary to the expectations of many people. It runs contrary to the expectations of certain economic models, which hold that education is a public good and therefore it's going to be underfunded on the market. So what's going on here? Tell us something about the types of schools that you encountered and how it's possible that they were, in effect, from the West point of view anyway, more or less under the radar all this time.
Yeah, exactly right. So the main reason that parents are voting with their feet away from the state sector is that the state sector is failing them. And I think, as I say in my talk, these parents don't read World Bank reports. They don't wait around for governments to actually do something for them because their governments aren't going to do something for them. So these parents have to do something for themselves. And what happened for example, in India, entrepreneurs within certain areas were finding that government schools, were only teaching in either Hindi or the local language. And that's not what parents wanted. Parents wanted schools that were what's called English medium. That means that their children were going to learn to read and write in English. So local entrepreneurs, because these schools grow organically within the communities themselves, these entrepreneurs started off these what we call low-cost private schools in order to satisfy parental demand. And what happened, for example, in India, where parents started moving away from the government schools, because what you tend to think is that a government school will be provided free, but there are always these hidden costs. So parents still have to buy uniform, they have to buy books, there's transport to schools and so on. And the low-cost private schools weren't actually that much more costly for the parent than sending your child to a government school. A low-cost private school costs maybe $4, $5, $6 per month to send one child to school, which is about 6% of a daily wage earner's wage. So, for example, in India, what we found was that these low-cost private schools had sprung up because parents wanted English medium. That's the main thing, but also because the government schools were failing because teachers weren't turning up. Teachers aren't from the communities themselves, and parents noticed that teachers weren't teaching in government schools when they were supposed to be. And the similar things in the African countries is that it's become endemic that government school teachers often don't turn up or they don't teach because they're not from within the communities themselves. So they don't really understand the children. So parents recognise the fact that this is the one and only chance that their children are going to be educated. So if they don't grasp this chance now for their kids, then these children aren't going to be educated, and the route out of poverty becomes less and less if you haven't got an education. Do you want me to give you some of the figures, Tom, of some of the amount of schools that we found? Because maybe some of your listeners will be astounded as to how many schools there are.
Yeah, absolutely.
I should say, Tom, is that there are two types of private schools in most countries, and that's recognised and unrecognised, or recognised and unregistered. And the two types of schools usually exist. The recognised ones purportedly abide by the on-paper laws and rules. So that's the laws and rules that are on paper. This is a bit of a Hernando de Soto model going on here. But in reality, many of the schools just pay a bribe in order to gain that recognition. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It's actually a good thing, because most of these laws and rules are unattainable, like a 40 square metre playground in a slum area just isn't going to happen, or the teachers are going to have a trained teacher certificate, and that's not going to happen either. So, but there are these recognised schools that have ticked supposedly the boxes, and on the other side there's unrecognised schools that either haven't got recognition because they haven't got to that required quality, or they haven't paid the bribe, or they've just started off. So there are two types of private schools, but these private schools do not get any funding from the government. They are run totally by parents paying those monthly, termly, or daily fees.
To me, what's so amazing about this is that this is one of the objections people have when they're talking to libertarians and education comes up. Like, everybody's against the NSA spying on them. That's an easy one. But when education comes up, they think you must be crazy, especially in the developing countries. There's no way education can take place without massive government involvement. And then you turn around and show that, well, in fact, it exists. So the best argument against it can't possibly exist is, here it is.
Exactly. And, I think that James Buchanan said that education actually isn't a public good. It's a private good. It is excludable and it is rivalrous. So there are economic arguments there as well. But it's not what parents want. And if a supposedly free government system is failing them, as I say, these parents aren't going to stand for that, because this is the only chance that their kids are going to get educated. So, for example, the numbers are and were quite astounding when we wandered around these slum areas. So there we are with our muddy boots on, walking around the slums of Hyderabad, for example, which is a city in Andhra Pradesh, which is in southern India, and in three zones, which were Charminar, Banglaguda and Badapura, of 19 square miles. So we walked every alleyway, every street corner. We actually drew maps of this slum area, of this low-income area, so that we knew that we'd visited as many of the sort of in lanes and the alleyways that we could. We actually found 918 schools, and that's just in 19 square miles, and this is in the poorest zones of this one city. So we found 918 schools. 549 of them were private. That's 60% of the schools in the low-income areas of Hyderabad were private. And some of your listeners might be thinking, oh, well, these schools must be quite small. The government schools must be much bigger. But that wasn't the case. Some of these schools have 1,000 children in them, the private schools, and of the 250,000 children attending attending those 918 schools, 65% are going to these low-cost private schools. So that was in Hyderabad, that was in southern India, and a third of those schools were unrecognised schools. So this was actually a good news story because the government didn't know that the children in these unrecognised schools were actually attending school. So what we're saying is, one, this is a good news story because education for all is going to be much easier to achieve because there are these children going to these unrecognised schools that until our research were actually underneath the radar and people didn't know they were going. But then when we went to Africa, we found similar numbers. So, for example, in Ghana, in Gar, the peri-urban area of Accra, where there's about 500,000 inhabitants, 70% of them are living on less than $1.25 a day. We found 779 schools. 75% of them were private. And again, something like 65% of pupils in that region were going to these low-cost private schools. Similar findings in Nigeria, in Lagos State. And we also did research in Kibera, which is the biggest slum in East Africa, about the size of Central Park. And the reason we did the research there was that in 2003, free primary education had just been introduced, and we wanted to find out the effects that introducing free primary education would have on a private sector, because what we'd seen, for example, by E.G. West's work on looking at what happened to the private sector in 1870 in the British context was there was a crowding out of private schools, which destroyed the whole private sector altogether. But actually for Kibera, we actually found that in 2003, we found 76 private schools. Now, when we say we found 76 private schools, we're not saying we found all of them, because obviously that some of them could have escaped our attention. But when we went back in 2008, we thought, oh gosh, maybe the low-cost private schools now aren't going to exist because free primary education has been introduced. But we actually found 116 private schools. So there was a massive increase in private schools, and there were many more children attending low-cost private schools than before free primary education was introduced. And this is because, well, some of the reasons are, for example, in Africa, it's because parents feel that these low-cost private schools are accountable to them. Because they pay a fee, they feel that they can go into the school, they can complain to the school owner, who can actually then complain to the teacher if they're not doing their job properly. There's no teacher unions in these low-cost private schools. Teachers typically get about a quarter of the wages of the government school teachers. So parents feel that also because these schools are within the communities, they're not run by people outside, they're run typically by people, entrepreneurs that they know, people from within the community that really understand their children. And so parents believe that these entrepreneurs, these schools will do better for them, one, because they're paying a fee and they can go and complain. In Kenya, when children went to the supposedly free government schools, although they actually turned out to be almost expensive as the low-cost private schools, when they so-called ran away, as the school entrepreneurs put it, to the free government schools. Parents felt that they couldn't go and complain to the headmistress in a government school, one, because she was of a different socio-economic background than they were. She didn't really understand their problems. And so when they went half a mile or a mile up to the government school, they just weren't listened to. And so initially they sent their children to these free, supposedly government schools, but then many of them came back to their low-cost private schools in Kibera, where they felt much more comfortable and much more able to complain or actually liaise with the teachers and the school entrepreneurs.
Pauline, I think I can anticipate an objection that a critic may have, or skeptic, let's say. That person may say that when you talk about all the schools that you've discovered, how can we compare them qualitatively to the government schools? Maybe the government schools are wonderful institutions that expose the children to many different sorts of perspectives and have a lot of resources and are able to do all kinds of things. Maybe what you're calling schools are just 5 parents in a room somewhere. How do you explain that these are qualitatively comparable institutions? And also, if I'm not burdening you too much with one question, can you compare the results? Do you have any data on output, on how well the students wind up doing in one system as opposed to the other?
That's a really good question, Tom. And I think it's easy to judge these and just have sort of your philosophical baggage and say, well, they're doing much better. But that was one of the issues that, first of all, we did the survey and the censuses, and then we wanted to look at the quality. So we actually used 3 approaches within the John Templeton Foundation research. And the first one was talking to parents to see what they believed the quality was in the government and the private schools. Then we did a survey of input by every school that we went to. Ourselves and the researchers would go into classrooms and find out whether there was drinking water, if there was a playground, the library, desks, chairs, and so on. So what actually were the facilities like? And then finally, we did a survey of achievement with the pupils. We've actually now tested 32,000 children around the world in maths, English, and other language or another subject. And we've compared those with government school children's results as well. In the John Templeton research, we tested around 24,000 children in the African context and the Indian context. And what we found was that almost in every single place with a survey of inputs, private schools statistically significantly better than the government schools, the facilities, bar one, which was actually the playground. Government schools typically had a better playground, but private schools were much more likely to have drinking water. They were much more likely to have desks, chairs, and also the teacher was much more likely to be present and likely to be active when he or she was supposed to be. The survey of achievement, as I say, we've now tested 32,000 children around the world, and we have papers in, for example, the School Effectiveness Journal, and I'm sure we could put links for your listeners to actually find out the papers. We have them in journals, and we've written books and articles about it. But what we did was, as I say, we tested the children, but we also gathered data on family background, and we also gathered data on innate ability so that we could control for innate ability and family background, and also school choice. So one way we analysed the data was doing what was called the Heckman-Lee two-step procedure, which is where you control for school choice, because obviously some people are going to say, well, the children in private schools are obviously going to be better than the ones in government schools because they've chosen to be there. So we actually controlled for that. And then we actually controlled for the child's IQ level, and we controlled for their family background. And still, in every case, we found there was a statistically significant difference between the children in the private schools and the government schools on their test scores. We also did multi-level modelling analysis just to do a different way, just to make sure that what we were saying was actually what the data said. And we also gave our data set to various other organisations, such as the NFER, the National Foundation for Educational Research in England, and they also analysed the data and also found the same thing, that if you're a child in a private school, you're much more likely to achieve higher than a child in a government school. But we're not the only ones that have done this research now. Gita Kingdon from the Institute of Education, she's done research looking at achievement levels, and she's found the same thing. Sometimes children in private schools are 1 to 2 years ahead of those in government schools. And in Pakistan, the LEAPS project has also looked at children's achievement and are finding that children in private schools are much further ahead than government schools. But this is mainly because teachers in private schools are teaching when they're supposed to be. So they teach from 9 till 4, whereas often in the government school teachers aren't teaching, or they're just not present. So those in government schools really do get left far behind.
Now, Pauline, how does this story tie in to the more general story of foreign aid? Wasn't education one of the areas that Western development aid was supposed to go to? Are the results that you see in the government schools, is this a subset of the more general story of the relative failure of foreign aid, or am I reading too much into this?
No, I agree with you, Tom. I think it is. But what you have to remember is that a lot of the bilateral aid and multilateral aid that went into education goes to government schools. And so, ironically, It's not the private schools that have been getting the aid. We've seen market success without international aid. And that's one of the reasons that I wrote my book, International Aid in Private Schools for the Poor, is because I feel very concerned that international aid might actually disrupt the market that is actually operating so well without, as George Aieti would say, this begging bowl that leaks. So yes, I think it's about $11 billion worth of bilateral aid in 2011 went into education. But what you have to remember, that's really trying to achieve education for all. But throwing money at government schools where there's no teacher, or where the teacher doesn't actually turn up, is actually just trying to get bums on seats, and bums on seats actually doesn't actually mean improving education. So education for all is a bit of a difficult one. It's a funny Millennium Development Goal, because just because the child is attending school doesn't actually mean that they're learning anything. But yes, you're absolutely right, Tom. I do think there's a problem now, and the reason I wrote the book was because I feel that, I'm not saying that we caused the problem, but because of our work, because it became so well known, there is now a concern that international aid agencies have noticed the low-cost private schools. So before our research, I know you didn't know about it, but before it became quite well known, international aid agencies, it was underneath the radar. They didn't really know about it. But now it's got their attention. So the reason I wrote the book was so that instead of international aid agencies just throwing money at these schools, and as William Easterly would say, acting as planners rather than searchers, the book was really to give international aid agencies and people who design policy ideas on how least to upset the market, and how maybe one could increase access and the quality of these low-cost private schools.
Now, before I let you run, can you say something about E.G. West? You work for the E.G. West Center, and I'd like those of my listeners who are unfamiliar with him to know something about him and his work. Okay,
so Eddie West, he was a great guy. He was an economist, and he actually also was a lecturer and a professor at Newcastle University, which is where the E.G. West Center is situated. And Eddie West went to the Mont Pelerin Society in the 1950s, and he was very much influenced by Hayek's idea that the socialists actually were using history as a way, and actually the wrong history, as a way of distorting historical facts. So what Eddie West did, he looked back into the archives, and he wanted to find out what was happening in England, and actually also in New York, in schooling terms, before the state actually got involved in schooling. And his findings were that the state jumped onto a horse that was already galloping. He found that children were already being educated in England in 1833. He went through documents and censuses to find out that children were already being educated privately. Durham miners could read. People were reading because they wanted to read the Bible, and it wasn't because they needed government schools to do that. There were lots of different ways of being educated. So the Mechanics Institutes, the Dame schools. Parents were prepared to pay for their children to go to school just as much as they are in India and Africa. And the same was happening in India in 1833 as well. There was this indigenous Indian private school system before the British actually imposed again their government system on India. And in 1831, I think it was, Gandhi actually did a talk at Chatham House, and he said that the British uprooted the beautiful tree of the village education or the village schooling system in India because they wanted to replicate something that they were doing in England, which was a bureaucratic, costly government system of schooling. So there was an indigenous schooling system both in England and in India before the state imposed their own system. So Eddie West was one of the first people really to highlight the fact that children were being schooled before 1833, which is when the government started giving some sort of handouts to people for schools to operate, and before the Education Act, the Foster Education Act of 1870. He wrote a book called Education in the State, which was published by the Institute of Economic Affairs. And I think at the time it was called Slanderous, and where had Eddie got the information from? But he won the court case, and I think it's in its second or third or fourth edition. So it's very much worth a read. And he's a complete hero. Eddie was going to come over to give a talk for us at Newcastle University, and we had just set up our research centre, and we were going to call it Catalaxia or something. And but unfortunately, Eddie was very poorly at the time, and we spoke to him and his wife Anne on the phone, and he was so looking forward to coming over. And then just before he was going to come over, he died. He died of cancer, and we were all very upset. So we all decided to call the centre the E.G. West Centre after Eddie West.
Well, that's absolutely wonderful. As I said, I didn't know there was such a center, and I'm so glad there's a center named after E.G. West. What's an easy way people can follow or find out more about your work and your book?
Yep. So for me, you can come onto the Newcastle University website or the E.G. West website. There's also an E.G. West Facebook page. But yes, the book's published by Edward Elgar. It was actually one of the top books of 2013 in the Times Literary Supplement. So that's all great news. And just really Google me and you'll be able to watch my TED Talk. And if anybody wants to get in contact with me, my email address will be Googleable.
All right, great. Well, we will also have links to the site that you mentioned in the show notes for this program. Well, thanks so much for taking some time with us from across the pond today. I'm so glad to hear about your work and equally glad that we had this chance to hear from you today. Thanks, Pauline.
Thanks, Tom. It's been brilliant.
That was Pauline Dixon on The Tom Woods Show, episode 71. Chapter 3, How Private Schools Educate the World's Poor, with James Tooley. James Tooley is the director of the E.G. West Center and the author of The Beautiful Tree, a personal journey into how the world's poorest people are educating themselves. This was episode 238 of The Tom Woods Show.
But now we're talking to James Tooley, whose work in this area is just extraordinary. I could spend all my time just listing for you the awards he's won, the recognition he has received. He is a professor of education policy at the University of Newcastle, where he directs the E.G. West Center. The book of his we're going to talk about today is The Beautiful Tree, a personal journey into how the world's poorest people are educating themselves. Stay tuned after my conversation with James Tooley for an important note about the future of this show. So don't go away after my chat. But James Tooley, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to talk to you, Tom.
You know, after I had Pauline Dixon, also of the E.G. West Center, as a guest earlier this year, I got a bunch of emails saying, well, now you obviously have to have James Tooley on to continue this conversation. What she told us in that appearance was quite surprising. And I'm sure I'm sure you get the same response when you go around telling people about a phenomenon, namely low-cost private schools in the developing world that no one would remotely have any way of knowing about.
It's still extraordinary to me. I've been talking about this actually for nearly 14 years now. 14 years ago I first came across this phenomenon. I've been talking about it almost since the day I found it. And I still get people who are surprised by it, even in their own countries. So I'm in India recently. I tell people, still there, they don't know about it. And certainly when I go to new countries to do further work, I've been recently in Liberia, South Sudan, and Sierra Leone, countries going through a terrible time at the moment, but the same phenomenon exists. But even there, you talk to people in government or NGOs and non-government organizations or middle-class people, and they don't know about it. So it is extraordinary. The poor are doing something with themselves all over the world, and yet somehow people refuse to accept that they're there, that they are doing it.
And you, in the book, The Beautiful Tree, you give us an overview of what's going on in a number of countries, and that is interesting too, that we're not dealing with an odd cultural attribute of one particular people in one part of the world. This phenomenon seems to replicate itself among cultures that have not interacted with each other. It seems to be going on all over the place.
Yeah, that is an extraordinary finding, isn't it? I mean, you put it very, very well. I first came across this phenomenon, actually, it was in Hyderabad, in India. And that's exactly what happened. People sort of took words out of your mouth and said, oh, it's just a cultural phenomenon happening amongst the Muslims in the old city of Hyderabad. Yeah, we know about it. But, it's not happening anywhere else. And then I got the research money from the John Templeton Foundation. They trusted that I was talking about something sensible. We went to Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, Zimbabwe, India, several parts of India, and even rural China. The same thing was happening in each of these places. And the same response to inadequate government schooling or no government schooling, poor people were setting up their own schools, charging roughly the same amount in each of these places, relative to the income of the country, and these schools were performing better than the alternatives. And it was even, the similarities were even to the extent of the proportion of children in private schools in each of these places. In urban areas, think of it, the great majority, 65 to 75% of children in these low-cost private schools in urban areas, and perhaps a quarter to a third in rural areas. The same picture, you can drop me in any country, almost will find the same thing going on.
I think
one
of the reasons it must be hard for some people to imagine is that we know that the daily income of these people is so low that the amount of money they could possibly have that we could conceivably think of as disposable income would be vanishingly small to nothing. How can a private school sustain itself under those conditions?
Yeah, but poverty is terrible, of course, but never overdo it, because remember the cost of living in these countries is incredibly low as well, and so the amount of money people have is enough. It turns out, it's not an a priori argument. It's not sort of us sitting here saying what can people afford. It turns out that even those on the poverty line, and we've done a lot of work in our recent studies in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and South Sudan, and Nigeria, looking at the poverty line, that respected, as it were, internationally respected poverty line of $1.25 per day. That poverty line, even on that, families can afford private school for their children. The fees are incredibly low, which means, now critics will say this, they'll jump at it straight away, they'll say, that means that teachers are paid very little, and therefore you're exploiting the potential teachers. Well, it's true, the teachers are paid considerably less than teachers in the government schools, maybe a third, some places even a smaller fraction than that. But there's no typically there are no shortage of teachers wanting that work for that price. So it suggests there's a market value there, and that these schools are not exploiting their staff. They're actually providing employment for local teachers in those communities, and doing a valuable job there. So yes, they are very low cost, and typically we're talking in African cases maybe $5 to $10 US dollars per month equivalent. That's the sort of figure we're looking at, maybe $3 to $7, $8 per month equivalent in India. But it can be provided. It's a fact. It's there, and when you look through the accounts of these schools, you can see, oh yes, I see how you do it. I see how it's affordable. We see what you're doing.
Now, Americans and I suppose British people as well have certain expectations when they hear the word school. They can picture the schoolhouse. They know that it goes from about 9 a.m. to 3 p.m., that there are certain subjects that are taught. So I suppose that what we're dealing with in many of these cases is something rather different. I mean, what kind of subject matter is discussed? How long are they in the schools? I bet there's no one answer to this question, of course, given the diversity of places.
But I would challenge you in what you just said. These are recognizably schools. They're recognizably a school building which starts, whether it's 8:30, 8 to 9, whatever it is, and carries on until 3 to 4 in the afternoon. It has timetabled lessons. It has the subjects are very familiar, to a British or an American audience: mathematics, English, science, social science, and of course local languages. And the building now, they vary in quality, of course, immensely, as you'd expect. But nonetheless, there is a recognizable building on a recognizable plot of land, doing a recognizable curriculum. So this is not something that American listeners, they'll think, I won't even be able to spot this. No, you'll spot it, you'll see it, you'll recognize it very much as a school as you know it.
I wanted to give you a chance to answer that question because I could imagine that one criticism would be maybe you're defining school so liberally that a small co-op of parents qualifies as a school. I wanted to make clear that this actually would be a school environment that would not be altogether remote from the experience of many people listening to this program.
Yeah, it's very important to stress that. And in our research, whenever we publish research in academic journals, whatever, we specify this, that we are not describing what other people might call non-formal, after school, alternative education. No, we're describing regular schools, and they are everywhere. Maybe 300,000 of these low-cost private schools in India alone, maybe 100,000 in Anglophone West Africa. It's an amazing phenomenon, but very much schools as you know them.
Now, what's going on in this regard in China? It's surprising that there would be a chapter on China. I could understand some countries aren't engaged in formal education simply because they lack the infrastructure to do it and the parents have to fend for themselves. But I would think with a regime like China, education serves a very important ideological service. So what's going on there? How can they allow any sort of competition to that?
Very interesting. And China, as you say, is a chapter in The Beautiful Tree. And I've done work since then in China. And there are two sorts of low-cost private school in China. And they're both very much, as you say, under the radar, a bit like the sort of independent churches you might get there. That's a similar sort of phenomenon, tolerated by the government, but perhaps one day there might be some more pressure on them, as there is in a lot of countries. But the two types, one is the one I describe in The Beautiful Tree. These are in the remote mountains, the foothills of the Himalayas. We were in Gansu province, which is one of the poorest provinces in northwest China. But there is a public school provided. It's not terrible. I mean, in India or in the African countries, the public schools are terrible, but this school is not terrible. The teachers are just about turning up. It's okay, but it's too far away. The children might live 2, 3, 4 hours walk away in further mountains. They're not going to be able to go to that school every day. They can't afford to board. They don't, or their parents need them at home. So therefore, these entrepreneurs set up private schools in their own villages. So government schools are there, public schools are there, but they're too far away. But the second type, and this is very interesting, is in the city, so big cities like Shanghai, Beijing, and so on. And that's where the migrant workers, the floating population, as the Chinese colorfully call them, the migrant workers from the rural areas, come to the cities. Now, in China, they're not really legal citizens of the cities. They're not really supposed to be there. So they come in, and they can't really access public schools, or if they do, they're discriminated against, and in any case, they may have more than one child, so some of the children won't even be, as it were, legal children. So again, entrepreneurs set up low-cost private schools in the poorer parts of the major cities, catering for the migrant population. So very interesting. Again, very much the government is controlling these schools still with the curriculum and so on, so they still will transfer the sort of ideological message required. But nonetheless, there are entrepreneurs working there. Very fascinating.
Well, one of the questions I asked Pauline Dixon involved the quality of the education, and it turns out that there has actually been work done whereby you have a benchmark of comparison, because you can compare these schools in some cases to government-run schools where the students are of the same demographic. You've got as close a controlled experiment as you could ask for, and these low-cost private schools seem to come out quite well.
Yes. I mean, we've done quite a lot of studies ourselves. I think in The Beautiful Tree, I report the studies from Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, and 2 or 3 parts of India and China. And other people have done, but we've now done studies from Sierra Leone, Liberia, South Sudan as well. And there are many other people, as it were, coming in on this, giving evidence. And a recent review from the British government, Department of International Development, DFID, came and said this was one of the most robust findings. Private schools, especially these low-cost private schools, outperform government schools. It's a robust finding across many countries and many studies, and in the vast majority of the subjects there. So they, and as you say, we've tested many children. You're able to control for the background variables. So this is not just looking at the raw test scores, as it were, and saying, the kids in the private schools are doing better. No, this is controlling for family background, mother's education, income in the family, proxies for wealth, and so on. So these private schools are doing better. Now, when you go to government schools in these places, it really is not much of a surprise, I mean, some few government schools might be okay, but in most of them, the teachers are not turning up on time. They're not teaching when they should be. They're getting the kids to do stuff for them or leaving them to play. So it's not really such a surprise in schools where the teachers are on task. The kids will be doing better. But they are doing better, and it's a wonderful one can celebrate this private entrepreneurship at the grassroots, doing something for themselves and doing it better than the government alternative, which has got, amongst other things, billions of dollars of aid thrown at it in order to improve it's not working.
Now, this is a wonderful story, but I wonder if you've ever had any critics who have said, this is a nice story you're telling, but I think James Tooley has an ideological agenda here. His main audience is not, or his main subject matter really is not the developing world, it's the Western world. He probably wants to cut education funding in the Western world, and he's using this as one of his arguments to do it.
Yeah, I mean, let's be let's be honest. One has a lot of critics, and a lot of critics will throw whatever they can at you, including these sort of ad hominem attacks and ideological attacks and so on. But I think when it comes across in The Beautiful Tree, I didn't go out there to find this. I grew up as a young man who was very much against this sort of thing. My doctoral thesis was supposed to be against the privatization of education. I was really reading, studying philosophical arguments, and then seeing this evidence has led me to the position where I am now. So I didn't come ideologically presupposed to find this, but the evidence when you see it is pretty overwhelming. But as for coming back to America, coming back to the UK, as it happens, I've spent most of my time over the last 10 years or so overseas, away from the developed West. But I am interested in America. I am interested in Britain. I'm just about a paper's just coming out in Social Philosophy and Policy, like a journal there, where I actually say, could this be relevant to America too? And it's based on the realization, of course, you've got charter schools, you've got various initiatives which are giving choice and alternatives to poor parents. But these charter schools have huge waiting lists. I remember reading about these waiting lists and thinking, okay, those parents, they're being frustrated. Maybe they would like some low-cost alternative. Could you create a low-cost private school alternative in America that could attract those parents? I'm interested in that, but it's certainly not the basis of my work. It's certainly not what inspires my work, but nonetheless, it could be an interesting sort of result of what I'm talking about.
Well, given the nature of my audience, I can't help asking about some other work you've done where you've evaluated some of the common claims about the need for government provision of education, and you've responded to them. So would you mind walking us through some of these? Because I have an audience that is very hardcore libertarian. It's a very big audience, and it's very hardcore libertarian. And I think this is one of the issues when they're talking to their friends, they run into the greatest objections. They run into the most brick walls. They say, look, I understand we don't want price controls on milk. We get that. But we do need government provision of schools because otherwise everyone would be illiterate and worshiping Thor.
Yeah. So the answer to that is it's not true. And actually, I'm not. I can't talk about the American evidence from memory. I can tell you the evidence from Britain from memory, and the evidence from America is somewhat similar. Okay, but before the state got involved in England and Wales in 1870, there was almost universal provision. Universal provision from the private sector, but that included churches, it included philanthropists, and it included these much maligned, what we call dame schools, but they were in effect low-cost private schools. So this movement was there in England and Wales before the government got involved. Similar evidence is from the American states as well, and the government got involved and eventually crowded out the system. So the first argument is no, it's not true that without the state you can't have any educational opportunities. In fact, educating your children, it is natural to parents, including poor parents, as feeding and clothing them. As soon as they got any chance of social mobility, they want their children educated. The vast majority do. Only a small minority, a tiny minority, maybe 5% it was in the England and Wales in the 19th century, were not getting their children educated. The second argument is, okay, people then talk about equality or equity or social justice. These are taboo words perhaps for your audience, but nonetheless, this is the arguments they'll get thrown their way. What about social justice? What about the poor? As to why my work is so valuable for this argument, because first of all you say, well, social justice is not served by public education anywhere in the countries we're working in, and I bet a lot of people feel the same way about poor parts of America too. Social justice is not being served by the public sector. The middle classes, the richer, the elite, they can always get the better public schools. They have school choice through house prices. Certainly that's the case in England. And obviously they can afford something else. But what this work is saying is the poor can afford private schools which cater to their needs, are responsive, and the social justice argument about the poorest of the poor, well, you can have targeted assistance for those families, for those students, maybe through some sort of targeted vouchers, scholarships, but also allowing entrepreneurship to flourish, because entrepreneurship in a competitive market can bring down prices. And this is what we're seeing in some of our work in West Africa in particular, where we're working with entrepreneurs and seeing how actually you can bring down the price even more to make them even more affordable for the poor. So I think there's a couple of arguments. Historically, it certainly wasn't true that the state was needed to provide educational opportunities, even in Britain and America. And certainly the social justice argument is not met. Social justice is not met by public education, but it can be met through private schools which are responsive to the needs of the poor, plus some targeted philanthropy.
James, before I let you go, you are director of the E.G. West Center at Newcastle University. And this question that I just asked you, I think, is a nice segue into discussing, just for a minute, if you would, the work of E.G. West, who, of course, did work on the history of education in its pre-state and post-state provision.
Exactly. And of course, it was his work I was citing just now when I spoke about the history of the education system, as it were, the private system in Victorian England and Wales. And he's also got evidence from New York and Massachusetts, as well as New South Wales in Australia. E.G. West, Professor Edwin George West, he finished his career as professor at Carleton University in Ottawa, but he began his career in this building where I'm speaking to you from now, in Newcastle. It was here he was a lecturer in economics. He wrote his masterpiece, really, in 1965, Education and the State, which was published by the Institute of Economic Affairs here. It's been republished by Liberty Fund in America. And he really put the cat amongst the pigeons of the statists who came up with those sort of arguments. Oh, you need government to bring education. And he was the major influence on my life. I hinted earlier when I started my PhD, I wanted to be writing against the privatization initiatives in education, or the so-called privatization there. I read E.G. West's Education and the State. It changed my life because it made me think the status quo of public education, we take it for granted so much, and we assume any modification to it has to be justified. What Eddie West says is the status quo of state education has only been there 100 years. It's only been there for a while, and it was imposed upon a free market of educational provision. It needs to be justified. It has to be justifying itself, not us trying to move away from it. That was a key insight that Eddie West's work brought to me.
Well, the book we've been talking about is The Beautiful Tree, a personal journey into how the world's poorest people are educating themselves. James, if people want to follow your work, should they go to the E.G. West Center online? Where should I send them?
Yeah, go to the E.G. West Center online and have a look there. I do tweet James_Tooley. Come and visit us online. Email me, james.tooley@ncl.ac.uk. I'm really interested in hearing people who are interested in this work. It's a terrific journey I've been on. There's lots more to do.
Well, I want to make sure listeners know we're talking about the British spelling of center here, E.G. West Center, CENTRE.com.
Yes.
Well, thanks so much for your time, James Tooley. A fascinating conversation.
It's been a pleasure talking to you, Tom. Thanks for phoning.
That was James Tooley on The Tom Woods Show, episode 238. Chapter 4, School vs. Education, with Brett Veinotte. Brett Veinotte hosts the School Sucks podcast. This was episode 303 of The Tom Woods Show.
We're talking today about schooling versus education. They are not the same thing. And we're talking to Brett Veinotte, host of the School Sucks podcast. He is a private educator, has been involved in various forms of private education and tutoring and other sorts of activities of that kind, and he joins us today to talk about all kinds of issues from home education to so-called unschooling, to resources that people can use, mistakes people sometimes make, all kinds of issues we can talk to him about. Make sure and stay tuned after my conversation with Brett for some special offers for all you education and home educating people. Stay tuned for that, as well as a little note about what's coming up tomorrow, an episode you won't want to miss. But right now, let's welcome Brett to the program. Brett, thanks for being here.
Hey, Tom, it's great to talk to you again.
I guess you and I met early last year at the Liberty Forum put on by the Free State Project. Are you actually in New Hampshire?
I am. I've been here pretty much since 2010, and I've been involved in one way or another, different levels at different times, but most of my activism has been around the show. So I'm connected here, and I think it's a great place to live, but you won't see me in any free Keen videos.
Okay. Well, you've got your podcast is, what category is it in iTunes? Do they have an education category?
Oh, yeah. There's actually quite a bit of competition in the education category because, anything that's like foreign language instruction or how-to, people throw it into the education category. I will say, though, that we are the only show that is consistently hitting on, schooling versus education and looking at school issues and not so much delving into all the problems of school, like zero tolerance. We did that in the early days of the show, and it got pretty tiring. Like now we're spending most of our time talking about what real education is, but also frequently reminding people that schooling, government schooling, is not that.
Well, I guess that's our starting point then. Before we can know that government schooling is not that, what is that? Then, in your view, what is education really all about?
Yeah, absolutely. To me, I think that education should really be self-directed, intrinsically motivated. It's lifelong. It's not something that's fixed to 12 years or 12 years plus 4 years plus 2 years of graduate school to be really educated. I think that people develop negative attitudes about what they call education because it's always associated with force and pain and boredom. And I think a lot of adults are left unmotivated to learn more, about a broad range of topics because the learning experience of school was so miserable for so many of us. So, most importantly, education is lifelong. It's intrinsically motivated. It's self-directed, and it's not something that somebody else gives you. It's something that you have to go out and seek for yourself.
It's important you make that point about it. It's not, education is more than just the time that you devote to formal study, that it is a lifelong process. I hear a lot of people saying to me, it's such a shame that when I was in school, I didn't learn the things I should have learned, and, oh, well, guess, what can I do now? Well,
Right.
You have your whole life is what you can do now. There are so many things you can do now. I hardly know where to begin in telling you, but we've become conditioned to think of education as something you do sitting in an uncomfortable chair with a built-in desktop with a chalkboard in front of you. Listening to this podcast is a form of education. Reading any worthwhile book is a form of education. I mean,
yes,
right?
Absolutely.
What about this self-directed issue, though? The response that you're liable to get, and perhaps even from me, is that this whole thing about the education needs to be child-centered and self-directed, and we need the child to be motivated, and the way you motivate the child is letting the child pursue what happens to be of interest to that particular child. That all seems to make sense, but there's that nagging feeling that a child just ain't going to be interested in the multiplication tables. And some things you just have to sit down and do, even though it is painful.
I think that you do. That's a very good point. And there is real instruction to be done, right? Like critical thinking, that classical education, that does involve a methodology that needs to be taught. I think that when you do have those things that need to be taught, you have to let it ride on top of the motivation and enthusiasm of the learner. So I'll give you an example. Last night we were doing a live show, and our topic was cryptoarchaeology. And I was just remembering this story. Like a few years ago, I was working with this homeschool boy. He as kind of just a facilitator and a guide. He was 8. He was absolutely fascinated by the Pseudo History Channel's program, Ancient Aliens. Are you familiar with this show?
I am not.
Okay. Have you heard of the ancient astronaut theory? That thousands of years ago, predating the great civilization of Egypt or Mesopotamia, aliens came and they seeded life on this planet, or somehow genetically modified human beings into what we are today. And there's people who take this very seriously, and they go back into the archaeological or anthropological records and they cherry pick information that fits that argument. So there's a lot of confirmation bias. There's a lot of logical fallacies. But if you're 8 years old and you're really enthusiastic about the idea of aliens, you're not really ready to defend yourself against that. And that was the situation for this boy. So he has definitely had this high level of motivation to pursue the study of ancient aliens. And the whole time, as the facilitator or the guide, I'm saying, oh, I don't know, this isn't good. Where's this going to go? And because he was enthusiastic, I was able to check off things that I thought he really needed to learn. Like, how do you evaluate the evidence that other people present? And there was all kinds of scientific lessons about astronomy and archaeology and anthropology, that we were able to check off along the way. So starting with something that is completely silly, the ancient aliens theory, and even if that is a plausible theory, the way they go about presenting it on this show is just completely laden with fallacies and confirmation bias and begging the question. But through that silly exploration, we were able to have a meaningful educational experience. So I think that the learner being motivated is very important. But once you have a curious and motivated learner, that's the stage is set for instruction to be possible.
So are you then an advocate of unschooling? Are you somebody whose view is that if that's what works for some people, that's fine, and if a more traditional structured curriculum works for somebody else, that's fine? Where do you come down on that?
I think it's different for everybody. I think anyone who wants to do home education, and I've tried to, in the last couple of years, even get away from the word unschooling because it has school in it, or homeschooling especially. only school can do school. We're trying to do education, so that means something totally different. I think that unschooling definitely has its challenges. I could see why people would balk at that, especially if they're concerned they're not going to be able to check off what they consider to be essential skills. And there's no debate about that. I mean, some things are essential skills. But I think that having that free environment where, the learner can follow his or her own curiosity is very important. But remember, too, that parents have, even if they don't want to control their child or control the curriculum, they have control over that environment. So they can put things into that environment. I remember this boy I was telling you about, his parents had built this amazing classroom for him filled with resources and, easy access to the internet and YouTube. So you can create opportunities within a relatively unstructured environment for, I think, the learning that you as the parent or the educator want to take place.
Brett, tell us about the podcast itself. You've got, how many episodes do you have so far? You've been doing it for a while, right?
Yeah, I think we recorded 322 last night. I mean, maybe I would say 350 different pieces of audio available on the website.
Wow, nice. Okay, well, this is episode 303 of this show, so we are catching up. We're catching up to you. By the way, the show notes page for this episode will be tomwoods.com/303. We'll have links to everything we're talking about here. Tell me about how you're able to talk about this stuff week in and week out and have fresh things to say. What kind of array of topics are you hitting on these days?
Yeah, that's a good question, because in the beginning, like back when I started in 2009, so much of this had built up. I mean, I had worked in and around the school system for over a decade, and in the 3 years prior to doing the podcast, I had been tutoring like in the Boston area and in the New Hampshire area in some very competitive public schools. I was doing a lot of SAT tutoring. I was doing a lot of academic tutoring, and I found myself in a lot of like meetings in the school with teachers and parents and guidance counselors, like really biting my lips, not saying the things that I wanted to say, not identifying the problems that I felt needed identification about the school system generally. So when I started the podcast in 2009, I blurted out, I feel like the first 20 episodes, what my problems were with school, what I believed to be the sort of hidden lessons of school, obedience, conformity, and even as a result of that, a kind of political or philosophical or intellectual apathy. I wound up doing a big series right out of the gate about understanding politics, because I wanted people to understand that I wasn't pursuing political solutions. Like, I didn't believe in the idea that the public schools could be reformed. We did a series on how kids are made to feel defective if they can't conform to that environment at school, and some of the consequences of nonconformity and how students could protect themselves from that. But after I did about 100 episodes, I said, okay, enough. Like, people get it. School is bad. It's right in the title of our show. Let's start talking about what education actually is. So we moved from there into, more in-depth series about history. We have had an ongoing series about solutions and alternatives. We did a big series last year about productivity and better organization. We've done series about logic and kind of, looking at pop media examples of people abusing logic or ignoring it completely. We did a show about like Bill Maher, for example, who has this very popular HBO show, and we went through episodes of his program, which stands up to the rest of television as a pretty intelligent debate show, and we looked at the fallacies that they used to make that program possible. We did a series on the trivium method of critical thinking, grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And we even did a series that I was really proud of this past year on the 6 pillars of self-esteem, which is based on a book by Nathaniel Branden. And, along the way, we're always, wherever we can, discussing homeschooling, home education, unschooling, and providing suggestions for that as well, talking with people who've done that. I'd like to be doing more of that, but I do try to check in periodically and say, hey, remember to consider these things as well. So the show is very broad. I mean, I think it's a soft sell, this idea that school sucks, especially since we're trying to reach high school and college students. Like, they come to us already on our side. I don't think there's a lot of people between the ages of 16 and 20 who feel very differently about school. And hopefully the show has provided a kind of window or doorway into the philosophy of liberty. I mean, I came to the philosophy of liberty by understanding the problems with the school system and wanting to investigate that more. So I'm hoping more people will do the same and have this, valuable introduction to this philosophy, the work of people like you, Bob Murphy, Jeffrey Tucker. They've all been on the show at one point or another, but we always bring it back to schooling versus education. And that's kind of the niche we've carved out. So there's plenty of work that we can do. I mean, as long as I've gotten to a point now after 300 episodes where as long as something is educational, I'd be willing to do a show about it. I do stay away from current events. I try to make the shows kind of timeless, but if I think it has educational value for my audience, I will definitely prepare a show and put it out.
What are some mistakes that you find home educators making?
I think that unschooling can become a kind of unparenting where some people are just completely hands-off with their children. And I don't really, I'm not a parent myself, and I say that over and over again in the show, and people who are critical of some of the things I say remind me of that frequently. So it is difficult to look at what other people are doing and have real specific criticisms, but just because you're doing this hands-off approach as far as education is concerned, I hope for people that doesn't turn into a hands-off approach as far as parenting is concerned. That's one caution that I have. Or even addressing the concern that you brought up earlier, not understanding that there are some essential skills that might require, even if it's more subtle, some form of instruction from an educator.
It seems
those are the two that come to mind.
Okay, I mean, those are very good. I know I can think of I'm going to use the term homeschooling just because I sometimes say civil war, even though I know it's full of problems. There's no way I'm going to retrain my brain in middle age at this point. But
Right.
I know very successful examples of it. But there is also, I think, an unreported underbelly of really unsuccessful examples. Now, that's not to say that it would be better to send them to the government indoctrination factory. I'm not in any way saying that, but I know of a lot of cases where, quote, homeschooling really means nothing happens. It really, and it's not even that they have a philosophy of unschooling. It's that the mother has a lot of children. She's totally overwhelmed. The father feels like it's his job to go and provide materially for the family, so it's up to the wife to do the homeschooling. She can't possibly keep up with it. She's expected to do the house and a million other things, and so the result is basically nothing happens. And this goes on far more than people realize because we all keep hearing about the spelling bee champion is a homeschooler, and the statistics for college admission are very good for homeschoolers, but the reality is there really is this problem out there of completely overwhelmed parents.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I'm surprised that anyone in, the second decade of the 21st century would still be trying to do this as an island, with the family as an island. There are so many great resources for, networking with people in your area. One of the things that we've talked about frequently is setting up some kind of cooperative where people can share the duties of teaching or monitoring or setting up activities. I can imagine that being terribly overwhelming for, one mother or one father with multiple children trying to have some kind of home education environment without any help from anybody else. There's so many resources out there for home education in many states. I mean, it differs from state to state. New Hampshire is obviously pretty friendly for home education, but there's definitely ways to get connected with people in your area, to share ideas. Even if you can't come face to face with people, there's resources online. I could see how there could be like a high level of burnout for a parent, and kids just wind up in front of a video game system. Not that that's entirely uneducational, depending on what they're doing. I think there's a lot of value in that, or there could be a lot of value in that, or in front of YouTube, or God forbid, in front of the television. I could see how that could happen. So I think that I am hoping to, on my show, reach people who are planning on becoming parents. Like, my target demographic is really about 16 to 24. I want high school and college students, and I want people thinking about these things long before they become parents. People have certainly written to me and said, it was because of your show, rather, that I took my children out of public school. And I feel like that's an accomplishment, but quite honestly, I also feel a little worried sometimes. Like, that's quite an impact to have. And, I hope those people who I don't know and I never talked to beyond a couple of email exchanges really thought this out. They really had a plan of action before they did this. And that was one of the reasons why I wanted to even get away from talking so much about the horror show that government school is, because I didn't want to force anyone's hand, so to speak. I wanted to talk about what real education is, the value that it has, different approaches to doing it, provide hopefully some curricula for self-study or home education. But I absolutely agree with the concern that, yes, there probably are a lot of people out there who are not providing an education or not setting up an environment where their children are seeking education for themselves.
Now, there are two reasons I would want to ask you about New Hampshire in particular. One is that you have personal experience there. But secondly, New Hampshire is not a state that's just chosen at random on this show. I mean, New Hampshire is the heart of the Free State Project. And there are people, no doubt, out there who are on the fence about whether or not they should commit to moving to New Hampshire. So I'd like you to give us a sense of what specific sorts of resources have developed around, for example, the Free State people who are living in New Hampshire, no doubt many of whom are interested in this kind of education. What are they doing among themselves that would be interesting to our audience here?
Well, I can speak from personal experience. We were able to set up just a small cooperative. It didn't last very long because, people went in different directions. But when I was working near the state capitol a couple years ago, we were able to set up some continuous art groups. There was a school, actually, that was set up called the Scholars Academy that had a real Free State presence and actually got a lot of financial support from Free Staters that went on for a few years. And I think eventually it dissolved because the directors of the school wanted to convert it into a charter school and get state funds instead of having it privately funded, and a lot of interests waned pretty quickly. But there are people just working together in small groups, what are they called? Play dates, where people bring their children together. And I'm not super connected to that, but I would like to see a lot more of it happening. I have seen, like I said, some examples of this in the past, but I think the good thing about this is your neighbors could be very, very like-minded, right? So even if it's a problem, people are getting more and more worried about things like CPS, especially people who are doing home education, and that's Child Protective Services for those who, it might be a different acronym for people in different states. But there's support here, and there's protection here. And that's important as well. I mean, I think that's just as important as people getting together and having an art group, that there are like-minded people nearby in case you have a problem as a result of what you're doing.
Would you say that the biggest stumbling blocks right now to more and more people embracing a home-based education or just something other than the typical government school form of education, would you say most of these stumbling blocks are external, restrictions by government or whatever cultural, frowning upon this form of education? Or would you say they're more internal, a lack of self-confidence? I'm not sure we could pull it off. I don't think we have the resources. We're not wealthy enough. Where do you think the real obstacles are right now?
Well, I think a lot of those internals that you mentioned are determined by externals. People saying, I can't do this, I'm not qualified, we both need to work. I think that kind of thinking results from external pressures. Most people don't leave the school system thinking they're capable of teaching anybody, and they're happy to depend on this system. And I would even think they would want to tell themselves a story about the goodness of the system because they need to put their kids someplace 35 hours a week while they go to work to earn the money that they need. So I'm completely sympathetic to all of the hesitations that people would have about pursuing home education for their own families. I really think it's both. I think there's a lot of economic pressures on people where most home education environments would involve at least one parent staying home multiple days out of the week. That's very difficult to do today. And of course, I think people don't feel, and I think there's a lot of training in feeling this way. They feel like they're not qualified to do this. This is something that has to be done by experts, So it's both. I hope through the show that people hear stories about others who've done this and others who want to do this, or even young people who've gone through the system, who've been home educated, and they get some success stories, and that builds confidence or shows them at least that, yes, this is something that is possible. And there's ways to do this even with all the external pressures of the world today. It's very hard for me to speak on external pressures that are related to the government because it's really so different from state to state. New Hampshire is pretty homeschooling friendly. I mentioned that I worked with this boy. I had to check in with his school district periodically. They were extremely flexible with me. They were just happy that we had created this environment and that learning was going on. They did not give me a very specific checklist. There was no periodic testing. They were happy that the advisor, I should say, it was just one person that I was dealing with directly from the school. He was really happy that we had come up with a milieu that was helpful to this boy. I know in some states it's very difficult. We hear these horror stories of parents being arrested, and their children they're saying their children are truants, even though because they haven't gone through all of the hoops that state has set up to make homeschooling difficult. So the pressures are more extreme in different places around the country, I think.
How can people find your show online? They can go to iTunes and type it in, but do you have a website?
Yeah, absolutely. Our website is schoolsucksproject.com, and if people are new, I would recommend clicking the first tab. It says New, Start Here, and it'll give you a basic introduction to the show. And it'll show you a bunch of series that we've done on a variety of different topics. There's a list of series that they can click through depending on what their interests are. We have a YouTube channel, which is School Sucks Podcast on YouTube. And I really encourage people to go and look around our website. There's lots of great resources and lots of great content there. If people are interested in getting more involved, we have a group on Facebook. If you just search Facebook for School Sucks Project, I would happily add anyone interested in home education or alternative education to the group. And there's a lot of dialogue that goes on there. So we're always welcoming new people.
So is that a closed group then?
It is a closed group. Like
there's nothing wrong with that. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. I just want to know.
Oh yeah, I'm actually thinking like if people want to join the group, I'll make sure it's a real Facebook account and I'll add them. I've thought about even setting up a more exclusive group for people who have specific interests or they want to have a specific dialogue with other people who are doing home education or exploring the possibility of doing home education. But, on the website, we have forums, too, that are broken up into all different categories. people can come to the website and join groups similar to how you would do on Facebook. So we have a home educators group on Facebook. We have a unschooled students group or a high school students group on the website. So I encourage website forums are certainly dying down because of Facebook, but if people wanted to come and make very specific connections, that's still possible through schoolsucksproject.com.
All right, I will make sure and direct people to the site and the podcast on the show notes page, which is tomwoods.com/303. Brett, thanks for being with us today. I had a number of requests to have you on. I'd been meaning to do it anyway, and I'm glad we're able to make it work. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Tom. Anytime.
That was Brett Veinotte on The Tom Woods Show, episode 303. Chapter 5, The Libertarian Homeschooler, with Anna Martin. Anna Martin runs the popular Facebook page The Libertarian Homeschooler at facebook.com/The Libertarian Homeschooler. This was episode 131 of The Tom Woods Show.
And we are joined today by Anna Martin, otherwise known as the Libertarian Homeschooler. She's got a huge Facebook page, The Libertarian Homeschooler, of course, facebook.com/The Libertarian Homeschooler. And even if you're not so interested in homeschooling, I think you'll find this an interesting conversation, because I want to ask questions like, do you think it's okay to have a libertarian curriculum for your kids, or do you feel like then you're indoctrinating the kids and that's not fair, and so on and so forth? So we're going to talk about all kinds of questions like that, and then at the end I've got some announcements that I think you guys might be interested in. But right now, let me welcome to the program Anna Martin. Anna, thanks so much for being here.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you.
I've got a bunch of things I want to ask you that I think some people who might be on the verge of trying out homeschooling would want to ask, and I bet they're the same kind of questions you get again and again. But it'd be nice on my program, where we haven't really talked about homeschooling, we haven't devoted an episode to it, to record those answers, to get them down once and for all. So let me start, though, with some background about you. How long have you been homeschooling, and how many children have you homeschooled?
Well, I have my two sons, and if you count, that my oldest is 13. You could say that we've technically been homeschooling since he was born, because there wasn't any time that we said, okay, now we're going to start homeschooling. So we've been homeschooling more or less for 13 years.
Okay, so you're not a case where there was some horror show at the local school and you just said, that's it, I'm pulling these kids out.
No. I knew well in advance of having children that we were going to be homeschooling. In fact, it was one of the first things that I said to my future husband when we went on our first date. I said, I'm going to be homeschooling any children I have. So if that's a problem, we should just make this sort of like we should go Dutch. I knew well in advance that we would be homeschooling.
So why? What's the main reason, or main couple of reasons?
The first reason, when I was younger, I really wanted to build a better beast. I've said that before. But it's true. I was looking to make someone who would be stronger, faster, and would get to the same place, but younger and better. But as I was homeschooling our older sons, and particularly as our second son sort of began to get older and more aware, it became clear that we were going to have to do something different. Because what we were doing with our older son, which was really pretty rigorous academically, wasn't going to work for our younger son. So we had to figure out something different for him. And at the same time, we realized, okay, this academic model for our older son, he's doing it because he loves us. But what he started doing is memorizing, regurgitating, and forgetting. And that really wasn't what we wanted him to do. So we had to sort of scrap everything that we were doing and begin again. And we started to follow his interests more. And what we found was he was still getting what he, quote unquote, needed, but just in a different way. So that's really what we did. And that's still how we homeschool. Does that answer the question that you asked?
Yeah, I think it does. Now, what do you say to people who hesitate because they feel like they're not smart enough, that if they sent their kids to school, there would be experts there who would teach their kids what their kids need to know, but my kids are going to need some advanced material somewhere down the line, and I'm not qualified to impart it to them?
two things. The first thing is the big secret about homeschooling is it changes the culture of the family. And it changes it in a really good and powerful way. And what happens is, as you are teaching your children and trying to figure out, okay, what do they need now? What is appropriate for this age? What are they going to need when they get out into the real world? You reintroduce yourself to these concepts that maybe you felt really rusty about, and you become much more interested because you're coming at it as an adult, but you're also teaching it, so you really have to own it now. And the culture of the family changes. You become much more intellectually fierce, and also intellectually fearless. And maybe that's not the culture of your family right now, but once you start homeschooling, something changes, and you become sort of a different person intellectually and academically. So who you are now and who your children are right now, particularly if they're in school, that's not who's going to be there even a year from now. So, yeah, you may feel like you're not qualified, but it's coming.
Wow, that's a bold statement. You know what I was expecting? I was expecting you to say, well, there are a lot of options that you have out there to bring in tutors, and the Internet has a lot of resources on it. I was not expecting that answer.
It happens, and that's why it's a big secret. Nobody expects this to happen. People are scared, and they say, gosh, I didn't even graduate from high school. But what happens is you've got skin in the game now. You want to teach your children. You want what's best for them, and you do whatever is necessary to educate your children. And the person who has the will to do that is the person who is qualified.
All right, but let me just raise the objection on everybody's minds. I don't know calculus, and I'm never going to know calculus. And no matter how much I love my kids, I'm never going to figure out calculus.
Sure, and you don't have to. If calculus is not something that you want to do, for me, it's German. My son is a musician. He wants to learn German. I really don't want to learn German. So I'm going to find someone to teach him German. I can find someone on the Internet. I can find someone in my town. I can find another musician to teach him German. There are lots and lots of different options. So many options now that weren't even available, 5-10 years ago. You can do calculus on the Internet. You can find a calculus teacher sitting in Hawaii waiting for you. You can do calculus at your community college. You can do calculus with a soup to nuts curriculum. You've got so many options.
You mentioned learning German. I just can't help mentioning when I was in grad school, I got the bright idea that I wanted to learn how to read German just because I thought that'd be a cool thing. Right? So over the summer, I took a German for reading knowledge course over at Union Theological Seminary because it was right near Columbia. And it was full of theologians who wanted to be able to read Martin Luther in the original German, and then just me, like just some guy. I just figured, well, I'll learn German. German is like the hardest. I mean, it makes Latin look like Spanish. I consider Spanish the model language because it's right. Every word is pronounced exactly the way you would think it would be. It's got very consistent rules and how it works. I love Spanish. German is just horrifyingly difficult to learn.
Well, and thank goodness I don't have to teach it.
That's right. Isn't that wonderful? Yeah, you've been liberated from this. I wanted you to appreciate just what a gift you've been given in not having to do that. And I mean,
I don't have to learn German.
I mean no offense to the German speakers out there. And I'm going to get some emails, believe me, say, no, German's very logical. Yeah, it is logical, but it's so weird the way the sentences are structured. Anyway, look, I'm getting completely off topic here. When somebody says, I think I'm interested in homeschooling, I think I'm ready to take the plunge, but I don't know what step one is. What's step one?
Boy, it depends. It depends on the person, but usually what I suggest is getting to understand the child. And pedagogically, I'm a Montessorian. I think that the work of Maria Montessori, the work that she has done on the child, is really sound. I can always rely on the work of Montessori to give me a really good idea of where the child is in terms of needs, capacities, development. That is so helpful. But the other thing that she does that might be even more important is she tells us how to observe our children, how to be with them, and how to really look at them and see what it is that they're doing without sort of our overlay. It's almost like observing a creature in the wild. you're looking at them and you're thinking, oh, well, they must be doing that because, and you sort of have this preconceived idea about why they might be doing whatever behavior. But really, it's something different. And if you observe over and over and over again, you get a better idea of what the truth is. And that's one of the most basic things about Montessori, is she teaches you how to observe. And that is so critical in homeschooling, to observe your child. So that's how I would start. I would start with Montessori. I'd begin with maybe the secret of childhood or the absorbent mind. The absorbent mind is a little bit chewy, but there also some other really good websites out there for the beginner. But that's what I usually tell people to start there.
All right, that leads me to a question where we might have some disagreement, but I don't want you to say what you think I want you to say. And you don't strike me as the type to do that anyway.
No, I won't do it, sorry.
What I gather from what you're saying here is, well, first of all, I don't want to just gather. Do you favor the so-called unschooling approach, or how does that differ from a Montessori approach, if at all?
It really doesn't differ significantly from the Montessori approach. In fact, something that made me feel really good, I was at a conference with Montessorians last summer, and somebody that I really respected in the Montessori community said to me, so what are you doing with your boys? And I said, well, we're really sort of following them at home. We're following the child at home. And she said, oh, you're unschooling. And I thought, yeah, but I don't really want to say that, because that brings a lot of baggage with it. The word unschooling, unfortunately, has a lot of stuff attached to it. So, yeah, we unschool in the sense that we follow our children. But I think people get the idea that you're unschooling, you're essentially leaving them be to their own devices. And really, nothing could be farther from the truth.
Well, I'm not so sure. I think there are some things that could be farther from the truth than that. How do the kids learn multiplication tables if they're being unschooled?
Interestingly, there's a story. My 9-year-old son, not too long ago, I came to him and I said, okay, I just want to see where you are with math. And so can I give you some addition to do just to see where you are? He said, I already know addition. Can you test me on multiplication instead? And I said, sure. And so I drew him a multiplication chart with, 1 through 10 on the top, 1 through 10 on the left-hand side, and he filled it in. I have not taught the child multiplication, but he knew how to do it. So now remember, I went to college. I have little letters behind my name. This to me is scandalous. I did not expect this. I really thought the child needed to sit down with me and learn his multiplication tables. So this to me has come as a really big surprise. I don't know exactly how this happens, but he's showing me that he does things on his own without telling me what he's doing. And then I just come back and I sort of check. And it sounds like voodoo or magic. But that's exactly what it looked like when I drew this chart on the whiteboard and he filled it in. I thought, who taught you this? How do you know this? I don't know where that happened. But he's around us doing math all the time. He's around us while we're reading all the time. He's around us while we're even, because we're really, really geeky. He's around us while we're diagramming sentences and thinking about music. And he does a lot of music, so maybe that has something to do with it. But he's around us learning all of the time, and he just seems to absorb a whole lot.
All right, well, back up a minute. When you say when you're sitting around diagramming sentences, that does sound like you're imparting instruction. I assume your family doesn't diagram sentences just for fun. That does sound like a structured educational...
That's so sad that you should say it, because in fact we do diagram sentences just for fun. There's a really fantastic app that you can put on your tablet or something, and it's called Sengram. And yeah, we actually do sit around and diagram sentences for fun. So some people don't do that, but there are all sorts of great educational apps. And I'm taking this off on a tangent. Maybe you want to go here later.
Yeah, no, do it now. Yeah, sure.
Okay, so there are great apps that you can use. There's a wonderful app, and this is part of the process, called DragonBox. Everybody who has seen my page knows how much I love DragonBox. It's algebra, but it's algebra in a very theoretical way. And it's a lot of fun. And it's even my 9-year-old is sitting there doing algebra on the tablet. He doesn't know it's algebra. But our 13-year-old is doing the same thing. Except when I work with him, I printed off a PDF form that shows all of the things that he's learning. And, this is called, the additive inverse. This is called, there's a whole list of things that Dragonbox covers, and it's a game. And so we do this, and then what I'll do is I'll take maybe a page from an algebra workbook or something, and I'll put out some problems, and I'll say, okay, what would you do if you were faced with this in Dragonbox? And he'll solve the algebra problem without having cracked a book. These things happen, and there's so much of this out there that it's amazing. Children are learning essentially to do things that they want to do, which really surprises me.
So is this the kind of discovery, when you discover apps like these, that you share with people over at the Libertarian Homeschooler?
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Now, I'm not an unschooler. I understand it. I'm okay with people who do it. It seems to have good results in some cases. But I wonder, can this really be for everyone? I can't imagine that all kids could actually follow something like this, and actually at the end of it you find that they are doing algebra and whatever. I mean, could it just be that your experience just happens to be with gifted children?
I'd like to say that, yes, my children are gifted. But I think, was it John Taylor Gatto that said genius is as common as dirt? We have to really be able to observe our children and look at them and figure out, okay, where's your sweet spot? Where are you really, really great? And we spend about 80% of our time in that sweet spot, in the place where they're really fantastic. Like my older son, he's an organist, he's a pianist, he sings with the boy choir. So a lot of the things that he does have to do with music. He spends 2 hours a day on the organ, 2 hours a day on the piano, at least 2 hours a day doing choir-related things. But also, music history is very interesting to him. Composition is very interesting to him. Right now, he's reading a book, which you and I would probably think there's not a chance I'm reading that. It's about the glorious pipe organ and its American masters. Who picks up this book? What 13-year-old child is reading this? If you can allow your child to do what it is that they really love for an extended period of time, I think that you will find that this happens. Now, some children really love a good workbook, so that child should not be discounted. And some children really, really love a curriculum, and that child should not be discounted either. But it really depends on the child. Some of them really want that structure. Every day I sit down at 9 o'clock, I do this thing. So yes, meet that child's need. Some of them want something completely different. Every day I go into the kitchen and I bake for 3 hours. And maybe that person is going to be a fantastic baker. You don't know. So really following the child, I think, is really important. And like I said, some of them are going to do so well with the curriculum, so well with something very structured. It really depends on the child. But I don't think that we can centrally plan for an individual. And children are individuals. So I really want to follow the individual.
Well, what about this? Suppose you have a student who does seem to be suited to a standard, structured sort of curriculum. Now, here was the question that I was driving at, and I didn't fully get to, because I think you and I could just talk for hours, going off on tangents and stuff. But what I wanted to get at, that I think we may have disagreement, but maybe not, would be: would you favor a curriculum that's expressly a libertarian curriculum, or would you feel like that's kind of imposing ideas on the kids instead of letting the kids discover them for themselves?
Well, I would definitely favor a strictly libertarian curriculum. In fact, some of the things that are not, and this is perhaps a little bit too stern, but some of the things that are not negotiable in our home are Austrian economics, political theory. Like right now, my 13-year-old is reading Hermann Hoppe, A Theory of Socialism and Capitalism.
That's a hard book for a 13-year-old, but he'll get something out of it.
We're reading it together. And so we read and then we read again, and we make sure that we've extracted the meaning out of a sentence, and then we move on. And when he was younger, we read Rothbard, and also at the same time, right now we're reading Menger. I don't think that you can deny a child what is true. I don't think that you can deny a child the knowledge that the moon goes around the Earth and the Earth goes around the sun. And in that exact same way, I don't think that you can deny a child the understanding of human action. You can't deny them the understanding of scarcity. You can't deny them the understanding of property rights.
Right.
I think these things are absolutely non-negotiable. They have to know these things.
You know, I'm particularly sensitive to this because, you know, in a minor way, I'm sort of in the public eye because I'm an author and I do a lot of public speaking. And so everybody kind of assumes that my kids are all going to be carbon copies of me. And if that should happen, if it turns out that they agree that their dad is right about things, I'm not going to be sad about that. That'd be great. But I always take care to explain to them that they're entitled to think things through on their own. And they don't have to reach the same answer that I reach to be accepted by me and to be part of the household and be loved and secure. And so I always make that clear to them, even though when they ask me something, what do you believe about this? I give them my answer and I justify it. And typically they do find that it makes some sense. They do understand that they are free to be individuals. And I always want them to understand that. When I was a professor, I always said, do not write in your paper what you think I want you to say. I will give you an A if you take Daniel Webster's view over Abel Upsher's view of the Constitution, even though I like Upsher, if you make a coherent argument, if you have a command of the material. So I've always been sensitive about this, that I don't want to be perceived as forcing something on them. I think of it in terms of I have this wonderful edifice of knowledge here that it took me a lifetime to acquire, and I would just so like to give them a leg up, to give them the chance to read books that I didn't even know about till I was 20 years older than they are now, and just to see their little eyes open so early on, it would just be exciting for me. But also, if they want the other side of the story, all they have to do is pick up the New York Times. They're surrounded by the other side of the story. There's no way I could keep it from them.
Yes, we listen to NPR just to that same purpose, you know. I understand exactly what you're saying. And there is the fear of indoctrinating your children. I think that, for me, the principles of Austrian economics are so, they're just so basic that it would be like indoctrinating somebody about gravity.
Right, or what a noun is or something.
Correct. There are first principles, and I think you really need to have those in order to understand the world. I don't think that you can really understand history until you've got a really good understanding of human action, property rights, economics are incredibly important. And so I want to give those to our children before we start talking about history, because if you can't look at history through the eyes of economics, I think that's really the lens that's most useful, I suppose, if I had to choose one. How do you know if you're looking at just the court historian indoctrination books?
Right.
You don't. So I think we really have to give that to our children first.
Now, let me ask you, just to address one of the most common objections that you get to homeschooling, the socialization objection, that the kids aren't going to know how to interact with other people because they're cooped up all day with one or two other kids, or they're all by themselves all the time and they're going to be socially inept.
Sure. Let me give a little backstory on that, because that's not such a completely crazy thought. Way back when homeschooling began and people took their children out of school, the choice essentially was to sit at the kitchen table and do school at home. And I've been told this by people who knew homeschoolers way back when. We're first generation in our house. And yes, sometimes people work, that's what they were doing. And so that piece of mythology has a little tiny bit of truth to it. Now, these people who started homeschooling, I can do what I'm doing because they did the legwork. They did all of that difficult work before I could do this. So we're really thankful to them. Also, because of the work that they did, we have tremendous opportunities all of the time. We have homeschool co-ops. We've got homeschool sports. We have, academic classes that we take together. We have, my youngest son just performed in The Wizard of Oz. There's so much out there. If you wanted to, you could fill up entire days, weeks, months, years with homeschool activities, and you would never even actually have to be in your house. You could be out of your house all day long, every day. So in terms of socialization, there are so many possibilities. Sometimes we have trouble figuring out exactly when we're going to come home and do what we really feel like we need to do. We've got to get 2 hours of piano in. We've got to leave now so that we can get this done. The other thing that's really exciting is that your children can be with toddlers, with babies. My 13-year-old son, I'm thinking of particularly, he hangs out with children who are younger than his, children who are older than his, but he also hangs out with adults because we make it our purpose, we make it our point to surround him with adults that are interested in the field that he is interested in. So we're going to, for example, just last week, we were at Mark Thornton's lecture in downtown Atlanta, and my son is there with all of his friends, with whom he can talk about economics or, policy questions. And so he's with adults all of the time. But not only that, when he's, say, at church on Wednesday night singing in the adult choir, there are people there that are in their 60s and 70s. So there's this whole wide array of people, different ages, different demographics, different income levels, religions, creeds, colors. Everybody is available to us. It's not just sitting in a room with people your own age from your zip code. I mean, how unnatural is that to be sitting in a room all day long with kids your age who make the same money that your parents do and are essentially having all the same experiences that you're having. It's a little bit weird because only 3% of the children are having this experience. But I think that the socialization is just different as a homeschooler.
Well, one last thing, and this is a practical objection. Don't you need to have at least one parent at home? And isn't that difficult for a lot of families to manage these days?
Some people, what they do is they flip their day. And so what they do is after work, everybody comes home. Children come home from their child care. Parents come home from their work, and they'll devote an hour or two to the basic lesson for the day for whatever you're doing, English, math, history, science. And then the next day they go back to their child care situation and they do their homework. And then they do it again the next day. Sometimes homeschooling can be done on the weekends. It can be done at night, and it is done so much faster. I think that about 2.5 hours is the maximum that is needed for the most basic of homeschooling curriculum.
All right, before I let you go, give us the overview of what the Libertarian Homeschooler is all about. You got a huge number of likes on Facebook. People can get there just going to Facebook, typing in the Libertarian Homeschooler, and you can get there directly by typing facebook.com/what? The Libertarian Homeschooler?
That's it, yes.
Okay, so tell us about it. Okay,
so the Libertarian Homeschooler happened at the same time as, I'm sure you're familiar with this, the Keynes and Hayek rap. Do you remember that?
I sure do.
Well, okay, so at that point, I had just, half a year before, I started listening to Milton Friedman on YouTube. And so he was my gateway drug. I came to Austria by way of Chicago. And I was watching the Keynes and Hayek rap, and I just thought, why don't I know any of this? And I went to Mises.org, and I started reading widely. And really, it was it was you and Bob Murphy. And it had, my sons would come in and they would listen to you and Bob Murphy lectures. And the reason that we chose the two of you was because our boys really like to hear you all talking.
Okay.
So, yeah. So we started really digging into the Austrian school, into economics, into philosophy, all of that. And I thought, boy, other people really need to know this. So I started the Libertarian Homeschooler. And people are really curious about homeschooling. They've heard about this mythical beast, the homeschooler, and they want to see what it looks like. And that's what we do on the page. You get to see pretty much, you just get a little glimpse into our day-to-day life. And we just look like normal people with our kids all day long. And that, I think, gives people a lot of hope. It encourages them. It makes them feel like, hey, I can probably do this. If I make mistakes, we talk about that. We say, you know what, here, I did it again. I still haven't learned this lesson. A lot of it is just practical relationship stuff. But I also like to put up, links to great stuff like Liberty Classroom, which we also love.
Thank you.
There are all kinds of great stuff up there. And there's a terrific list of notes that took a really long time to compile that people can look at on the page. It says Notes, March of 2014. And it goes from towards a libertarian view on the rights of children, and we look at Rothbard and Hoppe and Walter Block and a few other people, all the way down to a list of books that are really easy to find the libertarian thread in, like The Little Red Hen or Thidwick the Big-Hearted Moose, things like that. So that's got it's a sort of a smattering of everything, Libertarian Homeschooler.
Well, I hope people will check it out. You have quite a flourishing community over there, and I appreciate your time today. You've got a lot of interesting stuff to say, and it's Anna Martin, everybody. The Libertarian Homeschooler is both the website and the Facebook page. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate it.
That was Anna Martin on The Tom Woods Show, Episode 131. Chapter 6, The End of School, Reclaiming Education from the Classroom, with Zachary Slayback. Zachary Slayback is the Business Development Director for Praxis, a business apprenticeship program for young people, and the author of The End of School, Reclaiming Education from the Classroom. This was episode 623 of The Tom Woods Show.
Welcome, everybody. What a blast we're going to have today with Zachary Slayback. He's a co-founder of Praxis, which is an organization we've talked about in the past on the show that promotes entrepreneurship among younger people instead of just telling them to go through the usual grind, go to college, study sociology, and then have nothing to do. It's a very, very interesting alternative, and we're in particular going to talk about Zachary's forthcoming book called The End of School, subtitle Reclaiming Education from the Classroom. Wonderful stuff. We're going to have on the show notes page related episodes that I've done on education as well. That's tomwoods.com/623, and that's also where you can pre-order Zach's book. Zach, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Tom. I'm excited.
I think what you're doing is absolutely great. The things you're talking about, your forthcoming book, the work that you're doing, it's all great and exciting. I mean, in a way, you really are a pioneer in a lot of ways. And people will look back and say, if only we had listened to that dude years ago, we wouldn't have screwed up our lives.
Well, hopefully they do listen.
All right. Gosh, there are so many directions I could take this in. Let's start off with your own personal story. Mm-hmm. You were admitted to the University of Pennsylvania, which is an Ivy League school. Mm-hmm. I don't know how long you went there, but I do know that you did not complete your time there. Have you ever had any reason to regret that?
No, not so far. It's funny. I actually ran into the representative for the University of Pennsylvania in my region the other day, just in a cafe nearby. And I went up and I was talking to him, and he asked, "Oh, when did you graduate?" And I explained to him, "I didn't graduate." And he and I were talking about what I eventually went to go do instead of that. And he said, "You know what? Good for you. Too many people focus on just getting that degree. I have no regrets. In fact, I would say thus far in my life, it's one of the best decisions that I've made."
Now, that is going to be, I mean, you realize that you are violating one of the tenets of the American religion when you say that.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, college is part of American life. You send your kid to college. And, the thing is, I know this isn't your primary point, but when I think back when I used to teach, and I wouldn't say in my own undergraduate experience, but in the experience of a lot of people, when I look around at some of the people who are in college, I don't think to myself, we need more such people in college diverted for 4 years. We need more subsidies for this.
Yeah.
I think to the contrary, these people are there because their parents are forcing them or out of sheer inertia.
Yeah.
They're not there because they're saying, I'm deeply fascinated by the various subject matter. I would say it is a very, very small sliver of people who have any interest at all in any of the college work that they're doing. They want the certification and they want to get out of it.
Oh, yeah.
Now, but let me ask you the toughest question of all right at the beginning so that the rest of it will just be coasting for you. The fact is that given that today in our society, that whether you like this or not, the degree for certification purposes does seem to be important to a lot of employers. How can you say to people, well, you don't really need it?
You need to build a better signal. That's what you need to do. And what we are living in right now is a really exciting time if you're a young person in the United States right now. We're living in a time of a revolution in work, education, and entrepreneurship all at once. Because of the internet, because of all these other technologies around us, and because of how affordable and accessible they are, you can build a better signal, a better credential than just the college degree if you're an 18-year-old in the United States today. So people oftentimes ask me, where do you think disrupting higher education is going to come from? And they like to get caught up in like Coursera and Yale Open courses and things like that. And those are all good. And I'm glad that those are out there because that decentralizes and centralizes education at the same time. That makes it more accessible for plenty of people to actually learn things. But the market for higher education isn't a market for education. It's a market for the credential, right? So companies like Google, companies like WordPress and LinkedIn have done more to disrupt higher education than any of these other open courses, MOOCs, things like that have. Where we are is that an 18-year-old can build a website, can essentially build a business from the ground up for like $100, and that will signal more to me than somebody just giving me a bachelor's degree. And the employers I talk to every day, more and more are in agreement with me.
I think also the passive aspect of just sitting in a classroom, having information fed to you, and then the presumption that you'll then go out on the job market and again sit there passively, waiting to get a telephone call from somebody, encourages, passivity.
Yep.
And instead of, and by the way, I was as guilty of this as anyone. I went to college, I went to grad school, and then I sat there waiting for some employer to decide that I was worthy of hiring, instead of thinking, what if I do something? What if I grab or find or create opportunities and do them? And it's been a total change in my mentality because nothing I do now is automatic. There's no employer telling me to do them. I come up with ideas and I implement them, and some work and some don't. But I love doing it, and I would be horrified to be living my life any other way now.
Right. And I think it's because of the rate at which we're seeing more and more young people in the United States today being schooled in more and more ways. I meet families who throw their kids into school at like 3 years old. That's horrifying to me. And then they don't get out of school until they're like 25, 26 years old. Is it any surprise then that we're actually seeing a huge decline in entrepreneurship among young people? The answer is no, of course not. Because what you just described, that kind of activity, actually being active and not being passive in the sense of being in a classroom, is something that's necessary if you want to be an entrepreneur in any sense of the word, right? If you want to be an intellectual entrepreneur, if you want to be a tech entrepreneur, if you want to be an author, anything like that, that's something that can't be picked up in the classroom. And spending so much time in the classroom actually discourages the kind of activity, the kind of habits, the kind of skills that you need in order to succeed in life.
I had a guy on my show. You might enjoy this episode, even though you might not be into email marketing. But one of the great email marketers is a guy named Ben Settle. And I had him on my show, and he was great. And at the end, he said, look, because I had him on because he said a funny thing. He said, making money online is about as hard as falling off a log. There are so many ways to do it. But he said, look, all you need if you really want to do rock bottom is, you do have to come up with something that people want. That's true of any thing you're going to do in the economy, but you come up with a simple opt-in page and relentless email follow-up, and you're going to be successful. It's just it's not like brain surgery here, and yet with entrepreneurial opportunities everywhere, you can have your own store. You go to Shopify, start an account, you can have your own store by tomorrow. You don't even need to borrow any money from anybody. There's so many things that you could do. So in other words, at the time when the opportunities are the greatest they've ever been, nobody's trained to even be alert to them.
Yeah, no. If you want to start a tech company today, all you really need is to go get a website on Namecheap, you need a computer that you can code with, and you need Codecademy, right?
Yeah.
You'll need some experience to get better at those things over time, but you don't need to go sit and get a master's degree in computer science or machine learning just to build a basic kind of company like that. And the push to keep putting more and more young people in school longer and longer not only discourages stuff like that, but that stuff like that being entrepreneurship, being value creation, which benefits everybody in the economy, but it ends up making these young people incapable of actually figuring out what they love and what they enjoy in their lives. Millennials today are some of the most depressed and anxious people who've ever walked the earth. And it's because they have no kind of cognitive tools, no kind of philosophical tools, no kind of physical tools to actually build meaning for themselves in the world.
You know, I'm looking at your table of contents, and you've written this book the way I would want to write a book if I were writing one right now. You've got a whole bunch of subheadings within each chapter, and each one, as somebody scans that table of contents, is crying out to be read. So can I just throw a few at you, and you come back at us with what you're thinking in there?
Sure, absolutely.
Not too many, because we want people to buy this book. You'd be crazy. You'd be crazy not to buy this book. It's so much fun. But I want to start right at the top. You have school is keeping you down, and right under that, why haven't you dropped out of school?
Yeah.
Okay, so you got that. Now, I think we're kind of getting the gist of that. But what you have in here is that basically the idea is this. It basically boils down to schooling is not education, and
right.
you in fact have a subheading called that. What is the difference? I think people think they're the same.
Yeah. So schooling is a process. Schooling is something that's set up, and not all schooling is necessarily bad, right? But schooling that is forced on people is usually bad. And it is a process that people go through. Education is substance. Education is something that you have to engage in order to learn things, in order to adapt, in order to change. It's something that doesn't have a beginning or an end, right? You know, one of my favorite authors is Peter Thiel, the PayPal co-founder, and he says that one of the biggest issues with society today is that we oftentimes confuse process with substance, right? You see someone who has a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, a PhD, an LLM, and all these other things, and you just assume that they're going to be like one of the smartest people you meet, right? But that's not necessarily true. If you put them into an environment, even in a law firm in that case, they're not necessarily going to be the most skilled person there. Education is something that is highly individually driven. It has certain ends. I think that the end and the purpose of education is to equip people to identify what meaning is in their life and to try to achieve that meaning from their life. School, on the other hand, is usually meant to just impress bureaucrats, at least in the United States today.
There is still an understandable view that people have that an educated person needs to know certain things. They need to have a basic knowledge of certain subject matter that they're not likely to learn on their own.
Right.
My thinking on that has changed over the years. I used to think that too, that we got to herd them into a classroom because how else are they ever going to read Homer?
Right.
Or, how else are they ever going to do these other things? But I'm inclined to think now, I don't want to force people to do things they're going to be miserable about. They're just going to read the Cliff Notes anyway. They're not going to get anything out of it. Instead, I'd like to give people enough of a taste of the knowledge they could have so that in their own leisure time as adults, they have their whole lives to become educated. Whereas today, there's this sense that you got 4 years to become educated, and then after that, you go out and have your fun. I would rather promote the idea that you have your whole life to learn, to the contrary.
Right, and you have these young people, they get out of college at 22, 23 years old, and they haven't experienced any of that. They haven't experienced anything that is that people would generally view as leisure, which makes it that many of them are incredibly anxious people, and many of them have never experienced the classics, like you said. Many of them have never read Homer. Many of them don't know anything in the basic annals of Western civilization. So, I mean, I'm in complete agreement. I think that what you need to encourage in young people is the love of learning, right? I think that school oftentimes squashes the love of learning because it makes us view learning as work, right? And when we're young, the primary thing we want to do, what we're hardwired to do, is to play. And work and play, if we view them on separate ends of the spectrum, we don't want productive things that are beneficial to us, to fall into the category of work. We want things that are beneficial to us to fall under the category of play. As you probably know, you're most productive when you're having fun with something that you're doing. And very, very early on, when we start to put young people into schools, they start to view the process that would be learning. And it's oftentimes, many teachers are, good-hearted people who really do care about the success of young people. They are inadvertently, through the system in which they're in, teaching young people to view learning as work. And that's really dangerous.
Now, is this what you're driving at? Because you have a section called "You Graduated, Now Deschool Yourself."
Yeah, so I am a big proponent of this idea of deschooling. So people, while they're in school, pick up these really bad habits, these really bad skills, these really bad cultures that make it really difficult for them to succeed in the world. So my argument isn't merely that school is a bad place to learn, but my argument is that school oftentimes hurts people, right? And at the very, very core, like you just said, is that idea of viewing work and learning as two separate things, right? Or viewing learning as work. I like work in the sense of like productive labor. I don't like work in the sense of, drudgery, right? So at a very, very basic level, someone who has deschooled themselves has been able to parse apart drudgery and productive labor. Now, that's a really long and difficult process to do. And if you've gone through, like 20 years of schooling, most people don't achieve that in their entire lifetimes. I mean, that's why you see people when they retire, they don't do anything with their lives, or even like why they retire in the first place. In addition to that, we learn other habits that I think are really important to have deschooled out of us. One of those is the idea of domain dependence, that if we learn something in a certain area, that can't be applied to other areas. So when I was in high school, for example, I took a statistics class, and it was one of my favorite classes that I took. And it was really good at getting down to the ideas of sampling biases and of a lot of logical fallacies that are done in sampling biases and bad samples, bad studies. But many people will then go and like look at the election or look at polling and feel like, oh, this person's ahead, and it's because like one of the things I love seeing was when people are like, oh, Bernie Sanders is polling at number 1 in New Hampshire. And it's next to Vermont. Has nobody paid attention to this? People don't carry over the things they learn in one area into another. And that's probably the most dangerous thing that needs to be deschooled out of people.
I want to shift gears a bit because I know there's a complaint we hear mostly from conservatives that college has become this terrible place with political correctness and crazy people and all that. And if only we could just get back to the way college used to be. And you have a section called "There Never Was a Golden Age of Higher Ed." So what are you driving at with that? Yeah, what I'm really looking at there is that this idea that the golden age of higher education was this age where people went and they just became learned, right? And the main reason they went was because they were trying to pursue education. And that's true for some people, right? That's true for people who do go on largely to become academics. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But what I do in that section is I look back at the history and the evolution of higher education. If we really look back at higher education before the 1900s, it was essentially a training ground for the aristocracy, the training ground for the religious class, and a training ground for academics, right? Those were the three things. If you wanted to be an academic, you went into higher education. If you wanted to be a priest, you had to go into higher education. A lot of colleges started as religious colleges for that purpose. And if you were very, very wealthy and you wanted to be trained on the mannerisms of being a very wealthy person and your family was very wealthy, you went and it was essentially a 4-year summer camp. And what we had happen in the 1900s was we had something where after World War II, we started to see this growth of a middle class in the United States. And that middle class looked at successful people, right? They looked at wealthy people and they thought to themselves, okay, this person is wealthy, this person is successful, they've got a good job. Oh, they have a college degree. That must be why, right? So it's a post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, right? People looked at that and they confused the fact that this person had a college degree with the cause of them being successful. And then you had something like the GI Bill comes along, which funnels more and more people who normally wouldn't be able to afford something like college into college. And it's just something following a process of mimetics. Rene Girard's idea that we mimic the desires of other people around us. And I don't think that higher education has ever been something that
people go primarily to become learned. The main reason they've gone is because they want to be successful in the sense of like a monetary sense of the word or a job sense of the word.
All right, I want to tell you actually a little story just because it's from one of my followers, one of the people in my supporting listeners program. And I told his whole story in my email newsletter, which, by the way, my email newsletter is awesome. I send it out all the time. I don't care that that's not the way you're supposed to do it. It works for me, and it's funny and interesting, and I send it out every day. And you can jump on it at tomwoods.com. Just click the little red notify me button at the top. Well, anyway, a guy in my private Facebook group said, I just sold over 4,000 copies of my ebook. It's an ebook called Music Theory in One Lesson. And he, for somebody with no name recognition to sell 4,000 copies of an ebook in a matter of months, that's a real achievement. So I asked him, how did he do it? And the answer was extremely entrepreneurial. Well, I started answering people's questions on Facebook about music theory, or I would be on forums, and in my signature line, I would always include a link to my book. And, of course, it's a very catchy title. And just by doing that, by forming relationships, by building up a network of people who were interested in my answers, I built up people who wanted to find out what I was up to. And he's got a whole website now that he uses to sell lessons and so on and on. And he just did that starting from nothing and been just figuring out how would I promote, given that I have free resources to promote myself to the whole world and I don't have a big budget to spend, how would I do this? And he's been fantastically successful. I love stuff like that. And you know what? Nobody taught him how to do that.
No, that's one of those things that, going back to what I said earlier, where you can build a better signal. Okay, it's great for me to say something like that catchy line. Okay, Slayback, so what are you really talking about? How can I seriously do this? I met a young man the other day who dropped out of Ohio State and decided to travel for a couple weeks, couple months through Latin America. And he is now launching a Kickstarter campaign for the book that he wrote based on what he was doing there. And just, again, doing something very similar to what you're talking about, going through on forums, going through on Quora, going through on all these other platforms and talking to people like, people saying like, oh, I want to travel around, but I'm not rich. And he's like, I'm not rich either. You can travel around. You can do it on a budget. Here's how I did it. Here's the things I learned. And he's getting people who are following him on based on this. This kid's, he's probably 20 years old, and he's able to signal more to me from running a Kickstarter campaign, even if it's failed, than somebody would be able to signal to me by handing me a marketing business degree from even a good university, right? It's amazing. The resources that are available to people today. Your iPhone has the equivalent of about $1 million worth of resources from 1980 on it, and people just use it to, play Snapchat.
Yeah, I mean, and I think when in my own business endeavors I come up against a snag, the answer is almost always one Google search away. Mm-hmm. Or I join a coaching program for a couple of months to save myself 3 years of agony. I'm the sort, I'd rather spend money than time. Mm-hmm. Because time, right now, I don't have a lot of time. I have more money than I have time. I'd like some people to train me. But then once I've done, in other words, I can find the teachers that I need. There's a teacher for everything from, as we said, music instruction and language instruction, all the way up to how to segment your email list. You're just going to look for them. I sound like I'm complaining this whole episode. I'm just exasperated. I'm exasperated at people who look around and say, boy, this sure is a tough economy.
Right.
Yeah, it is a tough economy if you're thinking in the old 1980 model of how to live your life.
Yeah. No, I've been going around to different colleges and high schools in my region recently.
Whoa, you have? They let you in?
I know. I'm always shocked. I've been really pleasantly surprised by the response, especially from like guidance counselors and professors around here. But I was speaking to some students recently, some high school students, and I was telling them about these revolutions we're seeing in work, education, and entrepreneurship, and how entrepreneurship's easier, it's less risky, it's cheaper than ever before, how because of Google, because of LinkedIn, because of WordPress, all these other platforms, the value of the college degree is decreasing, not to mention the fact that you're going to be graduating with $37,000 in debt if you graduate in 2016. And the fact that there are computers that are going to be doing a lot of people's jobs in the next couple of years. And I keep giving versions of this talk, and I catch myself midway through, and I tell them, okay, it sounds like I am trying to scare you guys. It sounds like I'm being cranky, like old man Slayback's up here shaking his cane. But this is actually a really, really exciting time to be alive. the thing you have to do is you have to shake yourself out of the mindset that the people who are 30 years older than you have inculcated in you. One of the greatest injustices we do to young people is that we have the people giving them career advice being people who haven't been on the job market in 10, 15, 20 years. I think that's totally absurd. The job market is totally different today than it was 10 years ago. It's going to be totally different in 5 years from now. And we have people who make it their jobs when they haven't been on the job market for 15, 20 years to tell young people what the job market looks like today. That's bonkers. And that just does an injustice to young people.
I hope I could ask you something that's now not related to what we've been talking about, but yeah. I just love the I'm not sure I agree with it, but I love the heading, "Your high school friendships died out? Rejoice." Explain yourself.
Okay, so this was one that was just written one day when I was sitting around, scrolling around on Facebook and wasting time, and I just realized how many people on Facebook I was friends with that, I would not describe as my friends today. And I was talking to some of my friends about something similar about this. The fact that we put so much weight into our friendships that we have when we're young people. Oh, it's good to build friends. I'm not saying don't have friends, right? But the fact that we put so much weight into this and then we are so distressed over it when we graduate from college or when we're like 30 years old and we go back to like the high school reunion or something. I'm a big advocate for homeschooling, but I was not homeschooled myself. So I did go to a public high school. So I saw, I had friends from that. But schools are such an artificial place where the only thing you have in common with the people who are your friends in school oftentimes are the fact that you live in the same zip code as them and that you were born in the same arbitrary age range, right? That's totally that's a stupid way to determine who you should spend most of your time with. You don't have the time freedom when you're a young person to actually go find friends who share, similar values to you. They might have different interests, but I think it's important that people and their friends share similar values, right? Most of my friends from high school were people who were either my age, 1 year younger than me, or 1 year older than me. I couldn't even be friends with someone who's 4, 5, 6, 7 years older than me, which is one of the reasons I find it so crazy when people say like, oh, you're an advocate of homeschooling. How would homeschool kids become socialized? And it's like, you look at kids from high schools, the only people that they are trained to be socialized with are people their exact same age. 8 times out of 10, these are not valuable friendships for most people. They're friendships out of necessity. And I think that if you are a young person in school right now, again, I'm not telling you don't make friends, right? I'm telling you, one, be very discerning about who you become friends with. You have more control over it than you think. You will probably become friends with the people who are in your immediate groups, again, out of necessity, out of ease. But it doesn't have to be that way. And again, because the internet, I was fortunate when I was growing up that I was one of these nerds who would spend some time on internet forums and I made friends with people all around the country. If I hadn't done that, then most of my friends would be sitting in Somerset County, Pennsylvania right now.
Also, there are other opportunities to make friends. If you're not in high school, it's not like there are no other people in the world.
Right.
There are many ways. If you join a club or there are many, many different places that you can meet people. So that's one thing. And the second thing is, if I think a lot of people have not walked down the corridors of a typical high school in quite some time. If you do, you don't really say to yourself, boy, how impoverished I would be if I couldn't hang around with the people walking down this hallway. You don't say that.
Yeah. No, exactly. And the really unfortunate thing that we're seeing is these civic organizations, these youth organizations, the few things that do allow, if you are a young person, to build friends and networks and culture outside of the school, they're dying for some reason. Like the Boy Scouts are having a harder and harder time, recruiting Boy Scouts. The Freemasons have a youth organization. They're having a harder and harder time getting young people involved in that. Youth groups, things like that. And those are really important for young people to be able to branch out outside of where they are. I also think it's important, this is a point I make in the lead chapter to the book, the Why Haven't You Dropped Out of School chapter. I also do think it's really important if you are a young person to make friends who are much older than you, not just a year older than you, 2 years older than you. You need to have what I call a vertically diverse network, right? Because if we do view networking, and I mean this in the sense of actual friends, not in the sense of like, I'm going to go to the networking happy hour. Here's my business card. if you do view networking as professionally valuable, then someone who's your age is probably not going to be able to do much for you professionally, right? It's going to be someone who's a couple years older than you, 10, 15, 20 years older than you, who's going to be valuable to you. So these arguments you hear for college where they push young people into college, well, you need to go and like build a network, right? It's a great way of building a network. Yeah, those people could be helpful for you, but chances are if you actually went and worked for a company, worked near a president, a CEO of the company, a founder, met some of the venture capitalists involved, you're going to get much more valuable connections that way than spending 4 years with someone who's your age. That was a bit of an aside, so I just...
Yeah, but that's also an excellent point. We could really, this conversation could be a whole podcast of its own. And actually, Brett Veinotte already has a podcast more or less on this. Let's say something about praxis, though, even though I did have Isaac Morehouse on the show, but it's quite a while ago now, and I'm sure you have your own perspective on it anyway. Tell us about praxis and how people can find out about it.
Yeah, so the way I like to describe praxis is it's an entrepreneurship apprenticeship. We're reinventing the apprenticeship for the 21st century. I love the idea of the apprenticeship, but because of a couple reasons in the 20th century, more than anything else, it fell out of favor for most trades, save a few blue-collar trades, right? And there's nothing wrong with those blue-collar trades. I think the way that we diss on them culturally in the U.S. is a very bad thing. I'm a big fan of Mike Rowe's work in this way. But with Praxis, what we do is we take young people, 18, 25 or so, and we place them with entrepreneurs at growing businesses, startups, companies like that, where they get to work for 10 months with them, see what it's like. I had a meeting this morning. I'm based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I had a meeting this morning down on the rivers in Pittsburgh with the president and the founder of one of the fastest growing ad companies in the country. And I was describing Praxis to him. He was telling me, yes, I would love to have someone apprentice with me. And if we had this when I was, 18 years old, I probably wouldn't have gone to college because this is exactly the kind of thing that I was looking for. And it's hearing that I know that we're really onto something. We want young people to be able to take control of their education and take control of their careers. Like you said, a lot of people are just in college because of sheer inertia. A lot of smart people too, a lot of good, hardworking people. And I don't necessarily mean smart in sense of grades. Sometimes it correlates to grades, sometimes it doesn't. But you do hear people tell you in the U.S., yeah, too many young people go to college. I hear professors tell me this occasionally, but usually what they mean by that, and they're not wrong when they say this, but usually what they mean by that is like too many kids who are dumb are going to college, right? Too many kids that they don't want to be teaching to are going to college. But you also see too many smart, ambitious, hardworking, great work ethic young people going to college as well. And while they're in there, they're blowing a ton of money. They're blowing 4 years that they could be doing something else with. And they're, in my mind, and a lot of times they're picking up these really bad habits, right? So with Praxis, we really want to provide another opportunity to someone who's, 17, 18 years old, or even like 20 years old and currently in college and like this, I'm hungry to get out into the real world and build something because that's how I was. That's why I needed to pursue something like this and that they can come do this and work with someone who wants to be working with them.
Well, that's very exciting. Now, is it discoverpraxis.com? Okay, discoverpraxis.com is where people can find out about it. So that what we've been saying here today, it's not just abstractions,
right,
although I think we've tried to be as practical as possible. But here is a specific recommendation. You can check this thing out. I'm going to link to that, especially for people who are driving. Just remember the number 623, because at tomwoods.com/623, I'll have a link to Praxis, have a link to my conversation with Isaac Morehouse, who's also with Praxis, and related episodes that we've done on this subject. And, of course, a link to your book, The End of School, Reclaiming Education from the Classroom, which is available for pre-order. And people, you should pre-order this thing because you're going to pre-order it, and then a few weeks will go by and you'll forget that you pre-ordered it, and then you'll get it, and it'll be such a delight. You're going to say, I forgot about this, and it's 10 times better than even Wood said that it was. So anyway, best of luck with it. It's really great that you're doing. I mean, you are living the message that you're teaching, and it's extremely rare to come across that. You actually practice what you preach. So good for you, and congratulations.
Thank you. I think that it's important that you have to have skin in the game if you're saying something like this.
Exactly right. Well, again, thanks so much for your time, and best of luck with the book. I hope it's a smash success for you.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks for having me on.
That was Zachary Slayback on The Tom Woods Show. Episode 623. That does it for Education Without the State by Tom Woods. Remember to subscribe to The Tom Woods Show on iTunes or wherever you get podcasts to be the first to hear these episodes when they are released. If you found this audiobook valuable, consider visiting Libertarian.com to make a voluntary donation. Becoming a Libertarian patron will support this production and future projects like it. Go subscribe to Tom's newsletter. I am almost categorically anti-newsletter, yet I remain subscribed to Tom's because of the extra content, discounts, and bonus material. It's an easy way to support Tom, and you can always unsubscribe. If you have ever thought about homeschooling your children, or if you are already a homeschool family, consider looking into the Ron Paul Homeschool Curriculum. It's an economic and rigorous K-12 curriculum provided by a variety of accomplished instructors that will set your students apart, especially compared to those enrolled in government schools. You'll have to look into it yourself, but using Tom's link at ronpaulhomeschool.com will provide you with over $100 worth of free bonuses. Education Without the State is written by Tom Woods. This recording was done at Libertarian.com. Music provided by Keys of the Moon. The song, The Epic Hero, is under a Creative Commons license. Thank you for listening.